My name is Linda George. I am 31 years old. Midway through my wedding vows, my future mother-in-law stood up from the front row, turned her back to the altar, and led 22 members of her family out the heavy oak doors of the venue. They did not say a single word. They did not look back. There was just the synchronized sound of dress shoes on hardwood and the rustle of expensive fabric. What Beatrice Caldwell did not know as she led her orchestrated march toward the gravel parking lot was that her silent protest triggered a specific legal clause hidden in a trust document. She thought she was ruining my wedding. She was actually forfeiting an inheritance worth $4 million. Welcome back to Revenge Order, where silence is sometimes the loudest confession. If your in-laws ever tried to hijack your big day, tell me your story in the comments. Let me know your age and where you are listening from, and be sure to hit subscribe. I stood at the altar in a restored barn in Paradise Valley, Montana. Dust motes drifted through the shafts of afternoon sunlight. The officiant, a retired county judge named Wallace, stopped reading. His knuckles turned white against his leather binder. The remaining 60 guests on my side of the aisle sat frozen. The silence in the room pressed down on my chest like physical weight. I looked at Jason. His jaw clenched so tight the muscle pulsed beneath his skin. He watched the heavy oak doors swing shut. The metallic click of the brass latch echoed off the vaulted ceiling. I did not cry. Tears were exactly what Beatrice wanted. Instead, I tightened my grip on Jason's hands. I traced the calluses on his palms with my thumb. "Keep going," I whispered. He blinked, pulled his gaze from the closed doors, and focused on my face. To understand how 22 adults decided to stage a coordinated walkout, you have to understand the currency of the Caldwell family. That currency is control. I verify commercial titles for a living in Bozeman. I spend my days hunting for hidden liens, reading the fine print on thousands of acres of ranch land, and breaking down bad deals. I deal in hard facts. Beatrice deals in performed piety. Jason runs a fly fishing outfitter business. He spends his time on the Yellowstone River, reading water currents and guiding drift boats. He thrives in quiet, grounded spaces. His mother requires a constant, obedient audience. She rules the social hierarchy of an extreme local religious sect called the Congregation of the Valley. From the very first day Jason introduced us, I was an outsider. I earned my own paycheck. I paid my own mortgage. I did not attend her mandatory Wednesday night prayer meetings. 6 months into our relationship, Beatrice decided it was time to put me in my place. She invited us to a welcome dinner at her sprawling estate. It was not a dinner. It was an ambush. The drive to the estate took 40 minutes from downtown Bozeman. The November evening had already stripped the warmth from the air, leaving the Gallatin Range silhouetted against a bruising purple twilight. Jason gripped the steering wheel of his truck, his knuckles standing out stark white against his tanned skin. He kept his eyes fixed on the winding 2-lane blacktop. The heater blew dry air across my ankles, but the cab felt suffocatingly tense. He shifted gears as we began the steep incline toward the gated community. "My mother requires an audience," he said, his voice flat, devoid of its usual easy rhythm. "Just remember, she views every conversation as a negotiation." I nodded, watching the dark pines blur past the passenger window. I spend my professional life buried in county records, deciphering zoning laws and unearthing hidden liens on commercial properties. People lie on paper every single day. They hide bad debts behind LLCs and bury structural flaws under fresh paint. My brain is wired to look for the fault lines in any foundation. I was ready to read the terrain of Jason's family. Jason built his life away from that terrain. He runs a premier fly fishing outfitter service, guiding clients down the Yellowstone River. He deals in tangible realities: cold water, sharp hooks, changing weather patterns. Years ago, he quietly stepped away from his family's extreme religious sect, a highly insulated group calling themselves the Congregation of the Valley. He never made a dramatic exit. He simply stopped attending their mandatory Wednesday prayer circles and Sunday tithe collections. He chose the river over the pulpit. His mother, Beatrice, never forgave the defection. Beatrice Caldwell did not just attend the congregation. She dictated its social hierarchy. Her sprawling beige stucco house sat at the crest of the hill, looming over the valley like a fortress. Wrought iron gates parted silently as Jason's truck tires crunched onto the pristine circular driveway. The landscaping was too perfect for the harsh Montana climate, maintained by sheer financial force. Beatrice waited in the grand foyer. She wore a tailored cream cashmere sweater and pearl earrings. Her smile was a practiced, rigid curve that failed to reach her eyes. She hugged Jason, a stiff embrace that looked more like a territory claim, before turning to me. The scent of heavy floral perfume and roasting meat hung in the heated air. "Welcome to our sanctuary, Linda," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "We have been so anxious to uncover your heart." The phrasing made the hairs on my arms stand up. Not get to know you, uncover your heart. It sounded like an extraction. She led us past a sitting room filled with immaculate, untouchable antique furniture and into the formal dining room. The trap snapped shut the moment we crossed the threshold. I expected a family dinner. Jason's sister, Sarah, and her husband, Thomas, sat rigidly on one side of the long mahogany table. They stared at their empty water glasses, offering no greeting. But the real threat sat at the head of the table. A man in a dark, impeccably pressed suit, with silver hair and hands steepled under his chin, watched me enter. Jason stopped mid-stride. His hand went rigid against the small of my back. "Linda," Beatrice said, gesturing toward the imposing man, "this is Pastor Davies. He provides the spiritual covering for our family. I knew you would want his blessing." Beatrice pointed to a chair directly across from the pastor. She directed Jason to a seat 3 spaces down, effectively isolating me. In my line of work, I see attorneys try this seating maneuver during hostile depositions. They position the target in the crosshairs and remove their support system. I pulled out my own chair before Jason could reach it, sat down, and smoothed my napkin over my lap. I locked eyes with the pastor. I do not intimidate easily. The dinner commenced with a prayer that felt more like a targeted indictment. Pastor Davies asked the ceiling to provide guidance for those wandering in the bleak wilderness of secular pride. Sarah kept her head bowed so low, her chin touched her collarbone. Jason shifted in his seat, his boots scraping the hardwood floor, a subtle morning sound. Plates of pot roast, roasted carrots, and heavy potatoes circulated in tense silence. The clinking of silver against porcelain echoed loudly. Beatrice poured iced water from a crystal pitcher. "So, Linda," Pastor Davies began, his tone smooth, coated in a veneer of pastoral concern. "Beatrice tells me you are a title examiner. You spend your days looking at earthly boundaries. But tell me, where do you draw your spiritual boundaries? Which flock claims you on Sunday mornings?" I sliced a piece of carrot. My hands did not tremble. I kept my breathing even. "I spend my Sunday mornings preparing for the week ahead, Pastor. I find deep peace in clear ledgers and honest transactions. I do not currently belong to a church." A heavy, suffocating quiet descended on the room. Sarah stopped chewing. Thomas gripped his fork like a weapon. Beatrice set her crystal pitcher down. The thud of the heavy glass rang out. "A ledger cannot provide a moral compass, Linda," Beatrice said. Her voice dropped the artificial sweetness. The velvet was gone, only the iron remained. A woman, particularly a young woman, entering into a union, requires a strict covering. She needs to understand the divine principle of submission to a husband's righteous authority. Without a church, you are unmoored. You are a risk. I looked at Beatrice. I saw a woman terrified of losing her grip on her son. She needed a compliant daughter-in-law to bring Jason back into the fold. She needed someone like Sarah, silent and diminished. "I own my home, Beatrice," I said, keeping my tone perfectly conversational, as if we were discussing the weather. "I built my career verifying the ground underneath people's feet. I am financially independent. I view marriage as an equal partnership built on mutual respect. I do not submit. I collaborate." Pastor Davies leaned back in his chair. He exchanged a single, loaded glance with Beatrice. The verdict was passed without a word spoken. Beatrice dropped her silver fork onto her china plate. The sharp clatter made Sarah flinch. Beatrice turned her head, bypassing me entirely. She locked her gaze on her son. "She is unequally yoked, Jason," Beatrice stated. The pronouncement was frigid, echoing the rigid doctrines of her sect. "This cannot proceed. You are inviting spiritual ruin into this family. She will drag you into the dark." Jason did not argue. He did not raise his voice or attempt to defend my honor to a room full of people who had already convicted me. He simply stood up. He tossed his linen napkin onto his untouched plate. "We are leaving," he said. He walked behind my chair and pulled it back. I stood, smoothing my dress. I did not rush. I walked out of the dining room with my head held high, my heels clicking methodically against the hardwood floor. Jason retrieved my wool coat from the hallway closet and held it open for me. Right before the heavy front door swung shut, I turned back. Beatrice remained seated at the head of the table. She was not crying. She was not shouting after her son. Her lips were pressed into a thin, bloodless line. Her eyes were narrowed, running an invisible calculus. She realized intimidation had failed, which meant she needed to escalate her tactics. She had the financial and social resources of an entire congregation behind her. She had just declared a war she fully intended to win. But as Jason started the truck and we drove back down the dark, winding road toward Bozeman, I realized something Beatrice had forgotten. She wasn't the only one with resources. There was someone else in the Caldwell bloodline who possessed profound wealth, someone who despised Beatrice's performative piety just as much as I did. And he was about to give me the ultimate weapon. Not every branch on the Caldwell family tree carried rot. The antidote to Beatrice and her suffocating religious theater resided 40 miles north of town, living in a custom log home at the base of the Crazy Mountains. His name was Harrison Caldwell. He was Jason's 82-year-old grandfather. Harrison built the family fortune from the dirt up, accumulating 4,000 acres of prime Montana timberland through decades of blistered hands and calculated risks. I knew the patriarch of the Caldwell family long before Jason ever asked me to dinner. 2 years prior to our first date, Harrison walked into my commercial title office in Bozeman. He carried a rolled-up contract drafted by a regional developer who wanted to run an access road through his lower pastures. Harrison asked for a standard survey verification. I gave him much more than that. I spent 3 hours cross-referencing plat maps, historical deeds, and municipal zoning ordinances. Hidden deep within the boilerplate language, I found a microscopic clause that would have granted the developer perpetual mineral rights to the entire southern ridge. I called Harrison back into my office. I slid the contract across my desk, tapped the offending paragraph with my pen, and told him the deal was a predatory trap. I advised him to shred the paperwork and threaten the developer with a fraud countersuit. Harrison leaned back in his leather chair, studied my face for a long, silent minute, and then let out a booming, resonant laugh. He fired the developer the next morning. From that day forward, he respected my refusal to sugarcoat reality. When Jason finally took me to the timber estate to officially introduce me as his girlfriend, Harrison opened the heavy oak front door and smirked. He looked at Jason, then looked at me. "You brought the bulldog," Harrison said, his voice like gravel grinding under a heavy tire. "She has more spine than my entire bloodline combined. Hold on to this one, son." Harrison despised his daughter-in-law. He saw right through Beatrice's pious facade, recognizing it as a tool for control rather than a vessel for faith. Because of this shared understanding, Jason and I began spending our Sunday mornings at the timber estate, eating breakfast in Harrison's sunlit kitchen. We bypassed Beatrice's strict church day mandates entirely. The air in that cabin always smelled of black coffee, wood smoke, and pine. It became our refuge. During one of those crisp Sunday mornings, while Jason was outside chopping firewood, Harrison poured me a second cup of coffee and shared a piece of family history that shifted my entire understanding of the Caldwell dynamic. He sat across from me at the scarred wooden table, his pale blue eyes suddenly very sharp. "Beatrice parades around that church like she owns the moral high ground," Harrison said, stirring his mug. "But 20 years ago, she nearly bankrupted this family." I set my cup down, giving him my full attention. Harrison explained the true origins of Beatrice's devotion to the congregation. 2 decades ago, the timber yields were incredibly lucrative. The business accounts should have been overflowing. Instead, Harrison received a call from the bank warning him of bounced checks and overdrawn margins. He spent a week quietly auditing the ledgers himself. He discovered that Beatrice, acting as a bookkeeper for the family trust, had systematically funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars into the church's private expansion fund. She had forged signatures and manipulated tax documents, claiming divine right over the earthly wealth. "I confronted her," Harrison told me, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. "She did not apologize. She quoted scripture and told me the money was serving a higher purpose. The local lawyer we used back then was a deacon in her church. He helped her hide the transfers." "What did you do?" I asked. "I fired the lawyer that exact afternoon," Harrison replied. "I drove 3 hours to Billings and retained a secular corporate shark named Mr. Sterling. I restructured every single asset. I locked the trusts down so tight a mosquito could not slip through the cracks. But here is the vital part, Linda. Beatrice never knew I changed counsel. She still assumes her church cronies control my estate paperwork. She thinks when I die, her people will hand her the keys to the kingdom." That morning revelation laid bare the immense financial stakes simmering beneath the surface of our family dinners. It explained the desperation in Beatrice's eyes. She needed Jason compliant because she needed to control whatever inheritance flowed his way. As winter turned into early spring, Harrison's robust health began to fail. His lungs, worn down by decades of sawdust and harsh winters, finally betrayed him. He required a supplemental oxygen tank. His booming voice turned into a raspy whisper. Jason and I spent every available evening sitting by his bedside. During one of my solo visits, while Jason was picking up prescriptions from the pharmacy, Harrison gestured for me to pull my chair closer to his bed. The rhythmic hiss of the oxygen machine filled the quiet room. He fixed his pale eyes on mine. "Linda," he wheezed, pausing to catch his breath, "you read the fine print for a living. You know how property moves. Tell me about conditional disbursements." I leaned forward, switching from grieving prospective granddaughter to analytical professional. I explained the mechanics of restricted trusts. I detailed how an estate can be structured to release funds only if specific, observable criteria are met by the beneficiaries. I told him how clauses can dictate timelines, mandate specific actions, or penalize certain behaviors. Harrison nodded slowly. His calloused fingers tapped a steady rhythm against his wool blanket. He asked me a highly specific hypothetical question regarding the legal definition of attendance and disruption at a formal event. He wanted to know if a payout could hinge on someone staying in a room until a piece of paper was signed. I confirmed it was entirely legally binding, provided the language was drafted with ironclad precision. Harrison smiled, closed his eyes, and let out a long, satisfied breath. It was a tiny detail, a pebble dropped into a vast pond. I did not realize then that Harrison was designing a monumental legal payload. He was actively weaponizing his fortune from his deathbed to protect Jason and me. 3 months before our scheduled wedding, Harrison Caldwell passed away quietly in his sleep. The funeral was held at the Congregation of the Valley, despite Harrison's known distaste for the building. Beatrice orchestrated the entire event. She wore tailored black silk, standing at the front of the sanctuary, accepting condolences with the practiced grace of a reigning monarch. She directed the pallbearers with sharp, imperious hand gestures. She commanded the room. I stood beside Jason in the 3rd row, holding his hand as they carried his grandfather down the aisle. I watched Beatrice closely. Beneath the veil of her mourning, her posture had fundamentally altered. Her shoulders were pulled back. Her chin was held high. The matriarch was no longer waiting in the wings. She believed the final obstacle to her total dominance had just been buried in the Montana earth. With Harrison gone, the sprawling timber estate was locked in probate. Beatrice assumed she controlled the narrative and the impending fortune. As the final prayer echoed through the cavernous church, she turned her head and locked eyes with me. The look she gave me was devoid of any religious warmth. It was the calculated stare of a predator assessing a weakened target. She believed Jason had lost his only shield. She thought she held the purse strings to a $4 million empire, and I knew she intended to use that perceived power to eradicate me from her son's life. The subtle psychological games were over. Her next strike would target the foundation of our upcoming marriage, threatening the one day we thought belonged only to us. The week following Harrison's burial brought a profound shift in the Caldwell family dynamic. The sprawling timber estate plunged into the slow, bureaucratic gears of the Montana probate system. The legal freeze should have humbled Beatrice. It did the exact opposite. She operated under the ironclad assumption that the delay was a mere formality. She began acting like the undisputed sovereign of a vast kingdom. I watched her behavior change in subtle, terrifying ways. She traded her usual conservative sedans for a brand new luxury SUV, the dealer plates still gleaming on the back bumper. She started hosting lavish, catered luncheons for the church elders at her home, boasting about the future philanthropic endeavors the Caldwell family would soon undertake. She was spending capital she did not possess yet. Her newfound arrogance bled directly into her treatment of Jason. The subtle psychological games and icy dinner conversations escalated into a relentless, suffocating campaign to end our engagement. She called his phone at all hours. She left long voicemails quoting scripture about the dangers of binding his life to an unbeliever. When he stopped answering, she began showing up, unannounced, at his outfitter business. I stopped by the fly shop one Tuesday afternoon to bring Jason lunch. I found him standing behind the glass display counter, sorting through a fresh shipment of hand-tied flies. Beatrice stood opposite him. She wore a tailored trench coat, leaning over the glass case, her voice a low, urgent hiss. "You are choosing a fleeting, worldly attachment over eternal security, Jason," Beatrice said, her manicured finger tapping the glass. "She will isolate you. When the estate settles, you will need a partner who understands the responsibilities of our faith. Linda only understands her own ambition." Jason did not raise his voice. He set a small plastic box of dry flies onto the shelf. He looked his mother in the eye. "My choice is made," he replied, his tone steady and cold. "You can stand by us at the altar, or you can stay home, but you will not stand in my shop and insult my future wife." Beatrice turned and saw me waiting near the doorway. Her expression did not falter. She did not look embarrassed to be caught. She gave me a long, calculating stare, adjusted her coat, and walked out the front door, the small bell chiming a cheerful, jarring tune as she left. Jason rubbed the back of his neck, exhaling a deep, ragged breath. He looked exhausted. The constant barrage was wearing him down. I handed him his sandwich and kissed his cheek. I did not ask what she had said before I walked in. I did not need to. I had heard enough. But driving back to my office that afternoon, a quiet alarm bell started ringing in my mind. People who act out of genuine religious concern usually focus on saving a soul. Beatrice kept focusing on the estate. She mentioned responsibilities. She focused on the settling of assets. Her desperation felt distinctly worldly. My professional instincts took over. I spend 40 hours a week dissecting human behavior through the lens of property records. I know what panic looks like on paper. I know that when people push too hard, talk too fast, or demand sudden changes in a timeline, there is almost always a hidden liability driving their actions. I parked my car outside the title company, walked to my desk, and woke up my dual monitors. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed a low, steady frequency. I opened the Montana Cadastral Database. It is a public portal detailing property boundaries, ownership histories, and recorded liens. You just have to know where to look and how to interpret the codes. I typed in Beatrice Caldwell's name and pulled up the parcel map for her sprawling estate. The screen populated with a satellite view of her stucco fortress and pristine landscaping. I clicked on the Historical Document tab. I scrolled past the original deed of trust from when she and Jason's late father bought the land 30 years ago. I scrolled past the clear title recorded after the initial mortgage was paid off. Then I saw a new entry. 6 months ago, right around the time Jason and I announced our engagement, a new deed of trust was filed against the property. I clicked the hyperlink. The scanned document loaded on my right monitor. I leaned in, reading the fine print. Beatrice had taken out a second mortgage on her home. The sum was staggering, $250,000 in liquid cash. I checked the lender. It was not a standard local bank or a reputable national credit union. It was an out-of-state private lending firm. I know those firms. They cater to high-risk borrowers who cannot secure traditional financing. They require collateral, and they charge exorbitant interest rates. The paperwork indicated a punishing 15% interest bracket, requiring enormous monthly balloon payments. I sat back in my ergonomic chair. The air in my office suddenly felt very cold. The puzzle pieces rearranged themselves, snapping into a horrifying new picture. Why did the reigning matriarch of the Congregation of the Valley need $250,000 in fast, expensive cash? Where did that money go? There were no new additions to her house. The luxury SUV was leased. Her lifestyle was pricey, but it did not require that level of immediate capital. She was hiding a profound financial hemorrhage. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Her holy crusade against our marriage was a smokescreen. The spiritual interrogation at the dinner table, the unannounced visits to the fly shop, the relentless voicemails. None of it was about my agnostic beliefs or my refusal to submit to her church. It was about survival. Beatrice was drowning in debt. She was counting the days until Harrison died so she could use her assumed control of his estate to bail herself out. But Jason was entitled to a significant portion of that inheritance. If he married me, a secular title examiner who verifies financial records for a living, I would eventually see the ledgers. I would scrutinize the trust disbursements. I would spot the missing funds. Our marriage was not a spiritual threat. It was a forensic threat. I was the one person who could look at a spreadsheet and expose her. She needed Jason to marry someone compliant, someone like his sister Sarah, who never questioned the church authority. She needed a daughter-in-law who would blindly sign joint tax returns and ignore shifting bank balances. She needed Jason isolated from my scrutiny. I printed the deed of trust. The printer whirred, spitting out the pages of Beatrice's secret shame. I folded the papers and slid them into my leather briefcase. I did not tell Jason. He was still mourning his grandfather. He was already exhausted by his mother's daily assaults. Showing him the mortgage now would only break his heart further, and we did not yet know the full scope of her deception. I needed to know where that $250,000 went before I showed my hand. But the power dynamic had fundamentally shifted. Beatrice believed she was playing a game of righteous intimidation. She thought she held the high ground. She did not know I held the receipts. Her frantic need for capital explained her escalating behavior, but it also predicted her next move. If spiritual guilt could not break Jason's loyalty to me, she would have to resort to a legal barricade. She would have to find a way to separate his future assets from my legal reach before we said our vows. She needed a mechanism to strip his autonomy and hand the financial reins directly to her under the guise of religious protection. I waited, watching the days tick down on the calendar, wondering what form her desperation would take. I did not have to wait long. The answer arrived 3 weeks later. It came disguised as a family healing session, bringing a terrifying legal document designed to put a permanent leash on my future husband. The digital clock on my bedside table read 9:45 p.m. The house was quiet, save for the rhythmic hum of the dishwasher in the kitchen. I sat cross-legged on our duvet, wearing sweatpants, balancing a thick stack of legal-sized paper on a clipboard. Jason paced the perimeter of the bedroom. He had not taken off his boots. He walked with heavy, deliberate steps, wearing down the nap of the carpet near the window. He was vibrating with a specific kind of suppressed fury. 4 hours earlier, he had received a text from his mother asking him to meet her at a local coffee shop. She claimed it was for a private grief counseling session to discuss Harrison's upcoming memorial service details. She said Pastor Davies recommended they pray together to find peace. Jason, still navigating the fresh void his grandfather left behind, agreed to go. He wanted to believe she was finally extending a genuine olive branch. She did not bring a Bible. She brought a lawyer. When Jason arrived, Beatrice was seated in a back booth, flanked by a man named Elias Vance. Vance was a prominent attorney in Bozeman, but more importantly, he was a senior deacon at the Congregation of the Valley. He handled the church's real estate acquisitions and shielded their internal disputes from public courts. He was Beatrice's legal enforcer. They slid a bound document across the table before Jason even ordered a coffee. Vance called it a standard asset protection protocol. Beatrice called it a necessary spiritual boundary. They told Jason that because he was preparing to marry a secular outsider, the church elders required him to secure his future inheritance from Harrison's estate. They framed it as a shield against my potential greed. Jason took the document, stood up without speaking, and drove straight home to me. Now, sitting on our bed, I flipped to the third page of the contract. The heading read, Prenuptial Asset Allocation and Spiritual Compliance Agreement. I did not read it as a fiancé feeling insulted. I read it as a commercial title examiner trained to spot predatory leverage. And what I held in my hands was a masterpiece of financial coercion. Jason stopped pacing and leaned against the doorframe. Just tell me how bad it is, he said, his voice tight. It is not a prenup, Jason, I replied, keeping my tone analytical and detached. I tapped the thick paper with my pen. A prenup dictates how assets are divided if a marriage dissolves. This document dictates how you must live while the marriage exists. This is a conservatorship mechanism masquerading as family planning. I turned the page and began reading the clauses aloud. The language was dense, wrapped in legalese and religious phrasing, but the underlying intent was unmistakable. First, I pointed out the asset commingling clause. It stated that any inheritance Jason received from Harrison's estate could never be deposited into a joint account with me. It had to remain in a segregated trust managed by an approved fiduciary. The approved fiduciary listed in the appendix was Elias Vance. They want to put a padlock on your inheritance and hand the key to a church deacon, I explained. You would have to ask permission to access your own grandfather's money. Jason crossed his arms over his chest, his jaw locked. Keep going. I flipped to section 4. This was the section that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was titled Morality and Compliance. It stipulated that for Jason to retain active control over his dispersed assets, he must remain in good standing with the moral tenets of his family's faith. It required mandatory attendance at High Holy Days and mandated that any future children be dedicated within the congregation. But the real venom was hidden in the penalty clause. Listen to this sentence, I said, tracing the line with my pen tip. Should the beneficiary engage in actions deemed wayward by the spiritual elders, including but not limited to formal union with an unbeliever, the fiduciary reserves the right to suspend asset disbursement and redirect funds to the primary familial caretaker. I looked up from the clipboard. Jason was staring at me, his eyes dark and stormy. If you sign this, I told him, and then you marry me, they can legally declare you wayward. They can trigger this penalty clause the minute we say our vows. And the primary familial caretaker who gets your money? My mother, Jason said. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. I nodded. I thought about the hidden second mortgage I had discovered weeks prior, the crushing 15% interest rate Beatrice was secretly paying. The puzzle was complete. She knew Harrison's will would likely distribute funds directly to Jason. She needed access to his share to cover her massive debt. The spiritual guilt trips were failing. She needed a legal funnel to siphon his wealth back to her own sinking ship. She is trying to financially execute you, Jason. She is using God as a smokescreen to rob you. Jason did not shout. He did not throw anything. The betrayal was too profound for a temper tantrum. It was a cold, structural realization that the woman who raised him viewed him entirely as a highly liquid asset. He pushed off the doorframe, walked over to the bed, and took the clipboard from my hands. He unclipped the thick stack of paper. He walked out of the bedroom, grabbed his keys from the kitchen counter, and headed for the front door. "I'll be back," he said. I did not try to stop him. I did not ask to come along. He needed to handle this alone. He drove back up the winding road to the stucco fortress. He bypassed the security gate code he still had memorized and parked on the pristine circular driveway. He did not ring the bell. He unlocked the heavy front door and walked straight toward the kitchen where he knew Beatrice would be sitting at the marble island, drinking herbal tea and waiting for his capitulation. Jason told me later exactly how the confrontation played out. He did not yell. He walked up to the marble island and slammed the unsigned contract down. The heavy paper slapped against the stone, echoing in the cavernous, immaculate kitchen. Beatrice did not flinch. She set her teacup down delicately. "You forgot a pen, Jason," she said, her voice smooth and unbothered. "I will never sign that," Jason told her. "I will never let you or your church dictate my marriage or my grandfather's legacy. Do not ever put a contract in front of me again." He expected her to cry. He expected her to launch into a fiery sermon about his damned soul. He expected a performance. He got something far worse. Beatrice stood up. She smoothed the front of her silk blouse. She looked at her son with a chilling, vacant calm. The mask dropped entirely. There was no motherly concern left. There was only a desperate creditor looking at a defaulted loan. "You are making a grave error, Jason," she stated, her voice devoid of any warmth. "We offered you a shield. If you reject the family's protection, you reject the family. You will find it very cold outside the fold." It was an ultimatum. Sign over your autonomy or be excommunicated. She was willing to sever her relationship with her only son to maintain her empire and hide her crumbling finances. Jason turned his back on her and walked out. When he returned to our house, he looked hollowed out. The final thread connecting him to his childhood home had just been severed. We sat on the couch in silence for a long time. The reality of the situation settled over us like a heavy winter freeze. Beatrice had played her legal card and lost. She could not force him to sign the contract. She could not legally intercept the inheritance before the wedding. But a woman backed into a corner with $250,000 in high-interest debt does not surrender. She recalculates. If she could not control the money through a contract, she would have to destroy the marriage before it began. She would have to employ a tactic so psychologically devastating that Jason would break and call off the wedding himself. She needed a weapon from his past. She needed a diversion to keep me occupied while she laid the groundwork for her ultimate public sabotage. The legal battle had failed. The psychological warfare was about to begin. 2 weeks before our wedding date, the heavy silence radiating from the stucco fortress broke. Jason received a text message from his sister Sarah. She invited us to a casual backyard barbecue at her home in a newer subdivision on the west side of Bozeman. She promised it would just be burgers, potato salad, and family. It felt like an olive branch. It felt like a tentative ceasefire drafted by a sibling desperate to ease the tension before the big day. Jason read the text sitting at our kitchen counter. He tossed his phone onto the granite surface. "She wants us to come over this Saturday," he said, dragging a hand across his jaw. "My mother will be there." I set down the coffee mug I was drying. I knew Sarah rarely orchestrated anything without Beatrice pulling the strings from the shadows. But declining the invitation would give them ammunition. It would allow Beatrice to claim I was isolating Jason from his flesh and blood. In any conflict of attrition, you have to force the opposition to reveal their hand in plain daylight. "Tell her we will be there at noon," I replied. Sarah's subdivision consisted of identical houses with beige siding and manicured lawns that required too much water to survive the dry Montana summers. We parked on the street. The scent of burning charcoal and sweet relish drifted over the wooden privacy fence. We walked through the side gate. The patio was arranged with pristine white Adirondack chairs. Thomas, Sarah's husband, stood dutifully over a stainless steel grill, flipping patties with rigid concentration. He offered a tight nod as we approached. Beatrice sat under a canvas umbrella, wearing a pale blue linen dress, holding a plastic cup of lemonade. And sitting directly next to her was a woman I had never met, but whose ghost had hovered over the edges of Jason's past. Her name was Bethany. She was Jason's ex-girlfriend from 5 years prior. Bethany was the undisputed golden girl of the Congregation of the Valley. She wore a modest floral sundress. Her blonde hair fell in soft, yielding curls around her shoulders. She possessed the exact kind of gentle, unquestioning demeanor that Beatrice demanded from the women in her orbit. Jason had dated her right before he walked away from the church. Their breakup was not volatile. It was a fundamental divergence in reality. He wanted the vast, unpredictable currents of the river. She wanted the predictable, structured safety of the pew. Beatrice had not invited her to catch up. She had imported her as a weapon. Jason stopped walking. His grip on my hand tightened for a fraction of a second before he forced his muscles to relax. We stepped onto the concrete patio. "Bethany," Beatrice announced, her voice carrying over the sizzle of the grill, "look who finally decided to join our little fellowship." Bethany offered a bright, nervous smile. "Hi, Jason. It is so good to see you." Jason offered a polite, clipped greeting. He guided me to a wooden bench opposite the umbrella. I sat down, smoothing my jeans. I accepted a paper plate of brisket from Sarah, who refused to make eye contact with me. The psychological warfare commenced immediately. Beatrice ignored my presence entirely. She leaned toward Bethany, pitching her voice loud enough for the entire yard to hear. "We were just talking about that summer youth retreat up in the Bridger Mountains," Beatrice said, swirling the ice in her cup. "Do you remember how you and Jason organized the entire evening bonfire? You always had such a nurturing spirit, Bethany, a true servant's heart. It is so rare to find a woman these days who understands the sacred duty of building a home instead of just building a bank account." The subtext hung in the smoky air, heavy and deliberate. Beatrice was wielding Bethany as a mirror to reflect everything I was not. She wanted to provoke me. She wanted me to feel insecure, to snap, to throw my paper plate onto the patio and drag Jason away. If I reacted with anger, she could brand me as unstable and jealous. She could paint herself as the innocent victim of my secular rage. I took a bite of my brisket. The meat was dry. I chewed slowly, swallowing without water. I did not glare at Bethany. I actually felt a pang of pity for her. She was a pawn in a linen dress dragged into a backyard to serve as bait. I shifted my gaze to Beatrice. I evaluated her performance with the same clinical detachment I use when reviewing a fraudulent property deed. I saw the tension in her shoulders. I saw the rapid darting of her eyes as she waited for my inevitable breakdown. Her desperation was palpable. Jason did not wait for the performance to escalate. He did not play the game. He set his unopened can of soda onto the wooden railing of the deck. The metallic thud echoed sharply, cutting through the forced cheerfulness of the patio. He stood up. He did not look at Bethany. He looked directly at his mother. "It is a profound shame this family refuses to let go of the past," Jason said. His voice was not loud, but the timbre carried a finality that made Thomas freeze with his spatula in midair. "You are holding on to a ghost, Mother, and because of it, you are going to miss a beautiful future." He walked over to my bench and offered his hand. I took it, standing up with unhurried grace. I offered Sarah a polite nod, left my untouched plate on the seat, and walked out the gate beside my future husband. We did not speak on the drive home. We did not need to. Jason had drawn the boundary in permanent ink. The barbecue felt like a definitive victory. I thought we had survived her final, desperate attempt to derail our peace. I was wrong. The backyard drama was nothing but a smokescreen. The very next morning, a Tuesday, I was at my desk reviewing a commercial lease when my cell phone rang. The caller ID flashed the name Clara. Clara was the coordinator for our wedding venue, a historic timber-framed lodge nestled deep in the valley. "Linda," Clara said, her voice tight with panic, "we have a severe administrative crisis. I just got off the phone with the county zoning board." I sat forward, reaching for my notepad. "Define crisis, Clara." "Someone filed an anonymous complaint with the municipal clerk this morning," Clara explained. "They flagged our event profile. The Historic Lodge carries a standard beer and wine license. We filed for the temporary Class 4 catering addendum to serve spirits at your reception. The anonymous caller claimed we forged the municipal health department's sign-off on that specific addendum. The county is threatening to red tag your reception. If we pour a single drop of liquor, they will shut the entire wedding down and fine the venue." I closed my eyes. The timing was too precise. An anonymous complaint scrutinizing complex municipal permitting codes mere days before the event? Beatrice had made the call. She knew she could not stop the marriage legally, so she was attacking the logistics. A dry reception at a secular venue would allow her to whisper to her church cronies that God was removing his blessing from our union. It would turn a celebration into a tense, heavily monitored wake. I did not call Jason. He was guiding a 3-day fishing trip on the river with 0 cell service. I had to handle this alone. I spent the next 3 agonizing days submerged in bureaucratic friction. I cleared my calendar at work. I drove to the county clerk's office. I stood under the flickering fluorescent lights, clutching a numbered paper ticket, waiting for a plexiglass window to open. I pulled the original municipal health codes. I drafted expedited addendum forms. I paid rush processing fees out of my own pocket. I argued with the zoning supervisor for 45 minutes about the historical zoning boundaries of Paradise Valley. I fought Beatrice on my own turf. Paperwork, signatures, ironclad documentation. On Thursday afternoon, a weary county clerk brought a heavy rubber stamp down on my revised permit. The green ink seal validated our right to host the reception exactly as we planned. I walked out of the municipal building into the crisp Montana air, holding the stamped permit. I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated triumph. I called Clara and emailed her the PDF scan. Crisis averted. I had outsmarted the matriarch again. She tried to ruin the celebration, and I had neutralized the threat with clinical efficiency. I went to sleep that night feeling secure. I believed I had identified her strategy and defeated it. But Beatrice was a predator playing a much longer game. Her tactics resembled a magician's sleight of hand. The liquor license dispute was a bright, flashing object. It was designed to consume my energy, drain my focus, and draw my gaze entirely toward the reception hall. While I was fiercely guarding the bar and arguing with county clerks, I took my eyes off the altar. The real trap was already set, quietly waiting for the morning of the wedding, and the very next phone call we received from Harrison's attorney would reveal just how deep that trap went, shifting the stakes from a ruined party to a multi-million-dollar ticking clock. I survived the municipal zoning battle with a false sense of invincibility. I spent the remainder of the week finalizing seating charts and confirming floral deliveries, convinced the worst of the sabotage was behind us. I believed the battlefield was secure. I failed to recognize that when a predator misses their primary strike, they do not retreat. They simply wait for a narrower, more lethal opening. That opening revealed itself exactly 7 days before I was scheduled to walk down the aisle. The weather in Paradise Valley had turned bitter. The wind sweeping off the Absaroka Mountains carried the sharp, metallic scent of impending snow. I was sitting at our kitchen island, nursing a mug of dark roast coffee, reviewing a final vendor invoice. Jason walked through the front door, bringing the cold air inside with him. He dropped a stack of mail onto the granite counter. Among the glossy grocery circulars and utility bills sat a thick, stiff envelope made of heavy woven paper. It carried the return address of a prominent law firm located in Billings. The sender was Mr. Sterling. I recognized the name immediately. He was the secular corporate attorney Harrison hired 2 decades ago to lock down his assets. He was the man tasked with executing the final wishes of the Caldwell patriarch. Jason picked up the envelope, slid his thumb under the flap, and tore it open. He pulled out a crisp, single-page document bearing the official seal of the law firm. He scanned the paragraphs, his brow furrowing in confusion. "I do not understand this," Jason murmured, handing the paper across the counter. I set my coffee down and took the document. The header read, "Notice of Fiduciary Timeline and Estate Execution." My eyes tracked the precise, sterile legalese. Mr. Sterling was formally notifying all primary beneficiaries regarding the schedule for the final reading of Harrison's trust. The date was printed in bold, underlined text. The reading would not occur today. It would not occur tomorrow. It was firmly scheduled for the Monday immediately following our wedding weekend. Furthermore, the document contained a rigid addendum. It stated, per the strict and unalterable directives of the deceased, no liquid assets, property deeds, or preliminary disbursements shall be released prior to this specific date. All inquiries requesting expedited funds will be formally denied. Jason leaned against the counter, shaking his head. Why wait until Monday? The probate cleared on the land weeks ago. My mother told me she expected the transfer to happen this past Tuesday. Before I could answer, Jason's cell phone vibrated against the granite. The caller ID illuminated. It was Beatrice. Jason stared at the glowing screen. He tapped the green accept button and put the call on speaker, resting the device between us. "Jason," Beatrice said. She did not offer a greeting. Her voice lacked its usual polished cadence. Her consonants were clipped, her breathing shallow and uneven. "Did you receive a letter from that heathen lawyer in Billings today?" "I did," Jason replied, his tone guarded. "It is an outrage," she declared, the pitch of her voice rising. "It is a targeted insult to this family. I have spent the last 3 days leaving voicemails for Mr. Sterling, requesting a preliminary release of the operational funds. Do you know what his secretary told me? She told me the accounts are frozen until Monday. Why do you need operational funds right now, Mother?" Jason asked. There was a fraction of a second of dead air on the line. I heard the faint rustle of fabric, the sound of someone shifting their weight uncomfortably. "Because we have family expenses," she snapped, recovering her self-righteous armor. "I am trying to prepare the estate for the winter season. I was also planning to secure a cashier's check to help cover the final costs of your reception. It is humiliating to have my hands tied by a secular stranger." I looked at Jason. We exchanged a long, silent stare over the kitchen island. We had paid for every single element of the wedding ourselves. The catering, the historic lodge, the string quartet. We funded it all from our own savings. Beatrice had never offered a single dime. She had, in fact, spent the last 6 months trying to actively destroy the event. Her sudden, desperate desire to help cover the reception costs was a fabricated excuse. "We do not need your help with the reception," Jason told her quietly. "Everything is already handled." "That is not the point," Beatrice hissed. "The point is the disrespect. I expect you to call Mr. Sterling. As a primary heir, tell him you require the timeline expedited. Tell him we need the capital released before the weekend." "I cannot do that," Jason said. "Grandfather set the schedule. I am going to honor it." The line went silent again. This time, the silence was heavy, thick with suppressed panic. "You will regret this lack of loyalty, Jason," she whispered. The call disconnected. A sharp beep signaled the end of the conversation. Jason picked up his phone and slid it into his pocket. He looked exhausted. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, attributing her outburst to simple greed and her chronic need for control. "But I am a title examiner. I evaluate the paper trails people leave behind when they are running out of time. I stared at the formal letter from Mr. Sterling, and a chill settled over my skin. Beatrice was not angry about disrespect. She was terrified. My mind raced back to the Montana Cadastral Database, the hidden second mortgage, the $250,000 in high-interest debt secured against her stucco fortress, the brutal 15% interest rate. Her monthly balloon payment was likely due at the end of the week. She had been operating under the assumption that Harrison's death would provide an immediate influx of cash. She had leased a luxury vehicle and hosted catered luncheons, spending against an inheritance she did not actually possess. Her leverage was an illusion. She was broke, heavily leveraged, and staring down the barrel of a defaulted loan. She needed Mr. Sterling to open the vault. Mr. Sterling had just slammed the vault shut and bolted it. But the most profound revelation was not Beatrice's financial ruin. It was the specific date Mr. Sterling had chosen. A corporate attorney does not delay a multi-million-dollar estate execution to accommodate a family party. They schedule readings based on tax clearances, court dockets, and probate calendars. Tying the release of funds specifically to the Monday after our wedding was not a clerical coincidence. It was a behavioral condition. I remembered sitting beside Harrison's bed, listening to the rhythmic hiss of his oxygen tank. I remembered his raspy voice asking me a highly specific hypothetical question. He had asked how an estate could be structured to release funds only if observable criteria were met by the beneficiaries. He asked if a payout could hinge on someone staying in a room until a piece of paper was signed. The pebble he dropped in the water all those months ago suddenly produced a tidal wave. Harrison had weaponized his timeline. He delayed the reading to observe an event. He was using his fortune from beyond the grave to test his family. The tension in our kitchen shifted from a localized, interpersonal dispute into a ticking financial time bomb. Beatrice did not know about the behavioral conditions. She only knew the money was out of reach until Monday. If she could not stop the wedding through intimidation, and she could not legally intercept Jason's money with a predatory contract, her desperation would force her into a new, far more dangerous corner. If her financial survival depended on controlling Jason, and Jason was slipping away, what would a cornered predator do when surrounded by an audience? The answer began to materialize the very next evening. The calm before the storm shattered, not with a screaming argument, but with an absence so profound it sucked the oxygen out of the room. We walked into our rehearsal dinner expecting a tense meal. We arrived to find empty chairs, cold porcelain plates, and a chilling preview of the ultimate sabotage she was preparing for the altar. The Friday evening before a wedding is supposed to carry a specific kind of electricity. It is meant to be the deep breath before the plunge, surrounded by the people who built your foundation. We booked the private dining room at a high-end steakhouse in downtown Bozeman. The space featured exposed brick walls, warm amber lighting, and a roaring fire in a stone hearth. Snow drifted past the large industrial windows, dusting the sidewalks in a thin layer of white. Inside, the air smelled of seared ribeye, roasted garlic, and expensive red wine. The room was visually divided into two distinct halves. My side of the room buzzed with vibrant, unfiltered noise. I had 20 guests: my parents, my cousins who flew in from Ohio, my college roommates, and colleagues from the title firm. They leaned across the tables, clinking wine glasses, laughing loudly at old stories, and passing baskets of warm bread. Across the wide center aisle, a long banquet table sat waiting. It was meticulously set. 22 crystal water glasses caught the ambient light from the chandeliers. 22 heavy silver forks rested perfectly aligned with 22 porcelain plates. 22 linen napkins remained folded in stiff geometric triangles. The invitation stated a start time of 7 o'clock. At 7:15, the waitstaff began to hover near the swinging kitchen doors, casting uncertain glances toward the empty side of the room. The maitre d' checked his watch, then looked at me with a polite, questioning raise of his eyebrows. I shook my head, signaling him to wait. Jason stood near the mahogany bar at the back of the room. He wore a tailored charcoal blazer and a crisp white shirt. He held a glass of club soda. He kept sliding his phone out of his breast pocket, tapping the screen to illuminate it, and sliding it back. The blank screen reflected the dim lighting over and over. No text messages, no missed calls, no voicemails citing flat tires, icy roads, or delayed flights. I walked over to the bar and stood beside him. I did not wrap my arms around him or offer empty, soothing platitudes. In moments of profound betrayal, pity is a corrosive acid. I simply leaned my shoulder against his and watched the empty table with him. "They are not running late," Jason said. His voice was a flat, hollow monotone. "I know," I replied. The silence radiating from those 22 empty chairs was deafening. It was a synchronized ghosting. Beatrice had orchestrated a mass boycott. She utilized her iron-fisted authority within the congregation of the Valley to issue a silent edict. She likely framed attending our rehearsal dinner as an act of spiritual treason. The aunts, the uncles, the cousins, and his own sister Sarah had complied. They stayed away because defying Beatrice meant risking social exile from their insulated community. Beatrice was enacting a classic siege maneuver. She failed to secure Jason's inheritance through the predatory contract. She failed to ruin the reception logistics with her anonymous county zoning complaint. Now, she was attacking his psychological endurance. She wanted to starve him of familial affection on the eve of his marriage. She wanted him to stand in a room full of my relatives and feel the agonizing weight of his isolation. She wanted him to break, to pick up his phone, to call her, and to beg for her presence. The clock on the brick wall ticked forward, 7:30. I watched the exact moment the final shred of hope drained from Jason's posture. His broad shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. His jaw set into a rigid line. He did not excuse himself to the restroom. He did not retreat into a corner to fall apart. He set his glass of club soda onto the bar. The ice clinked against the rim. He walked directly toward the maitre d'. "We are ready for the first course," Jason told the man, his tone projecting clear authority. "But before you bring the food, I need your staff to strike that table." The maitre d' blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "Strike the table, sir?" "Remove the settings, take away the chairs, and break down the tables," Jason instructed. "Clear the space." The restaurant staff moved with swift, silent efficiency. They gathered the pristine silverware. They stacked the untouched porcelain plates. They folded the heavy tables and rolled them through the kitchen doors. The scraping of wooden chair legs against the tile floor echoed through the room. My family watched the dismantling of the Caldwell side of the room. The laughter died down, replaced by a quiet, fierce solidarity. My father stood up from his seat. He walked across the newly opened floor space, clamped a heavy hand onto Jason's shoulder, and guided him toward our tables. My uncles shifted their chairs, dragging them across the room to close the gap. My college roommates pulled out an empty seat right in the center of the chaos. They erased the void Beatrice tried to create. They physically bridged the empty space. When the first course arrived, Jason picked up a butter knife and tapped it against his wine glass. The sharp ring commanded the room. The low hum of conversation stopped entirely. Jason looked around the tables. He looked at my parents, my friends, and finally at me. His eyes were bright, reflecting the firelight from the hearth. "I prepared a speech for tonight," Jason began. He rested his hands on the edge of the table. "I plan to thank two families for coming together. I plan to talk about the history of the people who raised me. But standing here right now, I realize that history is just an anchor." He paused. He swallowed hard. The muscle in his jaw twitched. "I learned a profound lesson tonight," he continued, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the raw, unvarnished truth. "Blood is a biological fact. It is a shared surname and a geographic origin. But blood does not make a family. Family is an action. Family is a verb. Family is who shows up when it matters." He raised his glass. The liquid caught the light. "Thank you for showing up," he said, his voice cracking on the final syllable. "Thank you for being my family." My father raised his glass. Every single person in the room followed suit. The toast was a solemn, unified vow of protection. We drank, and the tension in the room broke, replaced by a deep, impenetrable warmth. Jason sat down, and for the first time all evening, a genuine smile touched his face. 10 minutes later, as the waitstaff cleared the salad plates, a sharp vibration rattled against the tabletop. Jason's cell phone illuminated. A new text message banner glowed on the lock screen. The sender was Beatrice. Jason stared at the device. He did not immediately reach for it. The phone sat there like a venomous insect. I leaned over his shoulder and we read the preview text together. "We will be at the wedding tomorrow to witness exactly what you deserve." Jason locked the screen and slid the phone back into his pocket. He shook his head, a dark, cynical laugh escaping his chest. "She thinks she is delivering a death sentence," he whispered. "She thinks her presence tomorrow is a threat." I looked down at my plate, letting the pure, unfiltered, dramatic irony wash over me. Beatrice sent that smug, arrogant text believing she held the ultimate power to ruin his big day. She planned to arrive at the venue and weaponize her attendance. She intended to sit in the front row and project a localized climate of misery, freezing the joy out of the room. She thought witnessing our union was her final act of judgment against a son who defied her. But I knew the contents of the letter from Mr. Sterling. I knew the strict, unalterable directives established by Harrison Caldwell. The patriarch had delayed the execution of his multi-million-dollar estate specifically to observe an event. He asked me those precise legal questions about the definitions of attendance and disruption. Harrison structured his trust to mandate observable behavior. Beatrice thought she was coming to wage psychological warfare. She did not know her promise to witness the event was about to become the very snare that would destroy her. Harrison's conditional will required her physical presence. The trap was set, the bait was taken, and the predator was willingly marching right into the cage. We left the steakhouse 2 hours later and walked into the freezing Montana night. Snow fell in thick, heavy flakes, coating the streets in a profound quiet. The rehearsal dinner was over. The battle lines were permanently drawn. I linked my arm through Jason's, bracing myself for the dawn. The listener now shared a secret with the bride, waiting for the sun to rise on a spectacular miscalculation, anticipating the moment the icy morning of the wedding would force the Caldwell matriarch to play her final, fatal hand. The morning of the wedding dawned with a biting, crystalline cold. The snowstorm from the previous evening had passed, leaving Paradise Valley buried under a thick blanket of pristine white. Sunlight glared off the frozen peaks of the Absaroka Range, refracting through the tall, leaded glass windows of the bridal suite located on the second floor of the historic lodge. The room smelled of hot styling tools, expensive floral perfume, and the faint underlying scent of old pine. My bridesmaids moved around me in a flutter of navy blue silk. They spoke in hushed, careful tones, treating the atmosphere like a fragile pane of glass. They knew about the empty chairs at the rehearsal dinner. My maid of honor, a former college roommate who saw through the Caldwell family dynamics years ago, stood near the window holding a steaming cup of tea. Her name was Jenna. She possessed a sharp intuition and a profound intolerance for bullies. I sat rigid in front of the vanity mirror, letting the makeup artist apply a final layer of setting powder. My hands rested in my lap. My fingers were ice cold. I traced the intricate lace appliques on the bodice of my gown, focusing on the tactile sensation of the fabric. In my profession, when a high-stakes commercial closing goes sideways, you do not panic. You review the addendums. You rely on the framework you built. I treated my emotional state the exact same way. I secured my perimeter. I waited for the opposition to make their move. At precisely 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the crunch of heavy tires rolling over frozen gravel echoed from the driveway below. Jenna lowered her teacup. She pulled the sheer curtain back an inch, peering down at the parking lot. Her spine stiffened. "They are here," she announced, her voice dropping into a flat, grim register. I stood up, crossed the wooden floorboards, and looked over her shoulder. The arrival did not resemble a joyous gathering of extended family. It looked like a coordinated deployment. 6 dark SUVs parked in perfect, uniform alignment. The doors opened in unison. 22 members of the Caldwell family stepped into the freezing air. They wore dark, muted wool coats. They did not speak to one another. They did not smile. They formed a tight, silent phalanx and began marching toward the heavy timber entrance of the lodge. It possessed the grim, inescapable gravity of a funeral procession. A few moments later, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Clara, the venue coordinator. The message read, "The groom's family has entered the lobby. Things are very tense down here." I learned later from Clara exactly how that lobby interaction unfolded. The lodge staff had prepared a welcome station featuring crystal flutes of expensive champagne and warm cider to greet the arriving guests. Clara offered a silver tray to Thomas, Jason's brother-in-law. Thomas looked at the tray, then looked at Beatrice, waiting for a silent command. Beatrice raised her hand, a single, sharp gesture of refusal. "We will not partake," she informed Clara, her tone echoing the hollow ring of a judge passing a sentence. "We are here strictly out of obligation." They bypassed the hospitality station entirely, leaving Clara holding a tray of untouched glasses. But the most calculated insult was not the rejected champagne. It was the garment Beatrice chose to wear. When she checked her wool coat at the cloakroom, she revealed a floor-length gown. The fabric was a pale, icy silver. In the dim, ambient lighting of the lodge, the material caught the light and flared with a brilliant, blinding sheen. It was fiercely, unmistakably close to white. It was a sartorial weapon, chosen deliberately to draw the eye, to challenge my status, and to broadcast her defiance to every single person in the room. The hostility continued to escalate when the hired photographer, a cheerful professional named David, approached the Caldwell group. Jason had paid David extra to arrive early and capture family portraits near the grand stone fireplace in the main hall before the guests took their seats. David raised his camera, offering a bright, welcoming smile. "If the Caldwell family could please gather near the hearth," he requested, gesturing toward the roaring fire. "We want to capture these moments before the ceremony begins." Beatrice stepped forward, blocking David from her relatives. "You will put that camera away," she instructed, her voice cold and unyielding. "We will not participate in a celebratory charade. We will only take photos after the ceremony, if we feel it is appropriate." David lowered his lens, bewildered by the sheer venom in her response. "If we feel it is appropriate." The implication hung in the air, toxic and heavy. Beatrice was publicly telegraphing her belief that the ceremony might not reach a successful conclusion. She was treating the marriage like a probationary hearing, reserving her approval for an outcome she fully intended to destroy. Having established their dominance in the lobby, the Caldwells did not mingle. They marched directly into the ceremony hall. The room was breathtaking. High vaulted ceilings, exposed wooden beams wrapped in winter greenery, and rows of pristine white chairs facing a large window framing the snowy peaks. The Caldwells claimed the front 3 rows on the right side of the aisle. They sat down with synchronized, robotic precision. They folded their hands in their laps. They stared straight ahead at the empty altar. Their faces were set in masks of stony, impenetrable judgment. They created a localized climate of misery, dropping the temperature of the room through sheer willpower. When my relatives and friends began to trickle into the hall, they encountered that wall of ice. The joyful chatter died in their throats. The vibrant energy of my side of the aisle collided with the suffocating silence of the Caldwells, creating a thick, oppressive friction. Beatrice and her clan were sitting there, daring us to proceed. They were daring Jason to walk down the aisle and face their collective scorn. The ticking clock on the bridal suite wall marked the final minutes. 10 minutes before the scheduled march, a quiet, deliberate knock sounded on the wooden door. Jenna opened it. Jason stood in the hallway. He wore a classic black tuxedo. The sharp tailoring accentuated the breadth of his shoulders, but the man inside the suit looked worn down to the bone. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. The relentless psychological siege had taken a profound toll on his endurance. "Can I have a minute with my fiancé?" Jason asked, looking past Jenna to find me. Jenna nodded, ushering the other bridesmaids out into the corridor and closing the door, leaving us alone in the quiet suite. Jason walked over to the window. He looked out at the frozen landscape, rubbing the back of his neck. He breathed in deeply, the sound harsh and jagged in the stillness. "They are sitting down there like a firing squad," Jason said. His voice lacked its usual steady cadence. It sounded frayed, stretched to the breaking point. "My mother is wearing silver. Sarah will not even look in my direction. The uncles are glaring at the floor." He turned away from the window and faced me. The pain in his expression was a physical ache. "I finally understand the strategy," he confessed, the realization crashing down on him. The prenup was just paperwork. The rehearsal dinner was just a warning. This, right now, is the actual attack. They are trying to humiliate me in front of your entire family. They are trying to make the atmosphere so incredibly toxic that we simply cannot endure it. He took a step closer, his hands dropping to his sides. "They want us to cancel it, Linda. They want me to cave. They want me to walk down there, feel the weight of their judgment, and surrender." I listened to the man I loved outline the exact contours of his mother's trap. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us. I did not offer him a soft, sympathetic embrace. He did not need pity. He needed a partner. He needed the commercial title examiner who knew how to hold the line when opposing counsel tried to force a breach of contract. I reached up and rested my hands on his chest. I smoothed the lapels of his tuxedo. I reached for his black bow tie, adjusting the knot with precise, methodical movements. The silk was smooth under my fingertips. I locked my gaze onto his eyes, refusing to let him look away. "They came here to witness a surrender," I said, keeping my voice low, steady, and infused with unbending iron. "They came here to watch you break. But we do not break, Jason. We hold the line." I flattened my palms against his heart, feeling the rapid, heavy thud against his ribs. "If they want to sit in the front row and radiate misery, let them," I told him. "Let them waste their energy. We are not negotiating with them anymore. We are rendering them irrelevant." I took a deep breath, drawing the cold air into my lungs. "Then we give them exactly what they came for," I stated, sealing the promise. "A marriage." Jason stared at me. The frayed edges of his composure seemed to stitch themselves back together. He covered my hands with his own, his grip firm and warm. A profound, hardened resolve settled over his features. The exhaustion retreated, replaced by a fierce, quiet defiance. He nodded once. "I will see you at the altar," he whispered. He turned and walked out of the suite, the door clicking shut behind him. The boulder was cresting the hill. The gravitational pull was now inescapable. The pressure inside the lodge reached its absolute zenith. Through the thick floorboards, I heard the sudden, resonant vibration of a cello string being tuned. The string quartet had taken their position. The first notes of the processional music drifted up the staircase, signaling the beginning of the end. The trap was armed, the audience was seated, and the final march toward the frozen altar had officially begun. The acoustic guitar began to play, the melody warm and resonant, echoing high into the exposed wooden rafters of the restored barn. I stood in the shadowed vestibule at the rear of the ceremony hall, waiting for my cue. My father stood beside me, offering his arm, his proud smile tight with unshed tears. Through the narrow crack between the double doors, I could see the aisle stretching forward, lined with winter greenery and flickering pillar candles. Before the music swelled for my entrance, I turned to Clara, the venue coordinator. She held a clipboard, her headset tucked discreetly behind her ear, monitoring the timeline. I placed my hand lightly on her forearm to secure her full attention. I gestured toward the entrance. The threshold separating the vestibule from the main hall featured a pair of towering, solid oak doors. They were thick, imposing structures, mounted on heavy iron hinges. On the interior side of the hall, I had noticed during the final walkthrough, they were equipped with thick, antique brass deadbolts. They were designed to seal the room entirely, likely a relic from the building's original history as a secure meeting lodge. "Clara," I whispered, keeping my voice low so the sound would not carry into the sanctuary, "I need you to do exactly what I say when the ceremony concludes. Right after Jason and I walk back up this aisle for the recessional, I want you to pull these oak doors shut." She nodded, tapping her pen against her clipboard. "Of course, we always close them to transition the space." "Not just close them," I corrected, my tone firm, leaving no room for interpretation. "You need to slide those brass deadbolts home. Lock them from the inside. We require unbroken, sealed privacy to sign the marriage license with the judge. I do not want a single guest wandering back inside until the ink is dry." Clara offered a professional, reassuring smile. "I understand. Sealed privacy for the signing. I will slide the deadbolts the second you cross the threshold." She thought I was merely a detail-oriented bride requesting a quiet moment for paperwork. She did not realize I was acting on the instincts of a commercial title examiner. When dealing with volatile opposition, you secure your perimeter. You ensure the boundaries of your transaction are impenetrable. The heavy brass hardware was a tool, and I had just loaded a very specific mechanism. The tempo of the guitar shifted, slowing into a deliberate, rhythmic march. Jenna, my maid of honor, stepped through the doorway, beginning her descent. My father patted my hand. "Ready?" he asked softly. I took a slow, deep breath, pulling the scent of pine needles and cold winter air into my lungs. "Ready." Clara pulled the heavy oak handles. The doors swung wide open, flooding the vestibule with golden afternoon light. We stepped over the threshold and onto the woven runner. The visual contrast inside the hall was jarring. It was a stark, physical manifestation of a fractured world. On the left side of the room, my people radiated warmth. My mother dabbed her eyes with the tissue. My college friends leaned out of their chairs beaming, their faces open and full of genuine joy. They turned their shoulders toward the aisle, bringing their energy into the center of the space. On the right side of the room, the temperature plummeted. The Caldwell family sat in a rigid, unbroken block. 22 adults occupied the front 3 rows. As I began my slow walk down the aisle, the fabric of my gown whispering against the floorboards, not a single one of them turned their head. It was a calculated, synchronized erasure. They stared straight ahead, fixing their gazes on the empty wooden podium, the floral arrangements, or the snowy peaks visible through the large window. They refused to acknowledge my presence. They refused to look at the dress, the flowers, or the woman walking toward their son. The oppressive weight of their disapproval felt like a sudden drop in barometric pressure. It was a tangible, physical force pressing against my skin. Sitting at the very edge of the front pew, Beatrice anchored the hostility. She wore the icy silver gown, the sheen of the fabric catching the ambient light like a sharp blade. Her posture was unnervingly stiff. Her hands rested in her lap, her fingers woven together so tightly her knuckles showed stark white. Her chin tilted upward in a posture of supreme, unyielding judgment. She was not merely attending a wedding. She was presiding over a heresy. I kept my chin level. I did not avert my eyes. I focused my entire field of vision on the end of the aisle. Jason stood waiting at the altar. His shoulders were broad, his dark tuxedo a sharp silhouette against the bright window. He did not look at his mother. He did not look at the 22 statues sitting in silent protest. He looked only at me. When I reached the front row, the suffocating aura of the Caldwell side peaked. I could hear the faint, irritated sigh escape Sarah's lips as I passed her chair. I ignored it. I stepped up to the altar. My father kissed my cheek, placed my hand in Jason's, and took his seat on the left. Jason's hands were incredibly warm. His grip was firm, grounding me instantly. His thumb swept across my knuckles, a silent, desperate communication of solidarity. We stood shoulder to shoulder, presenting a united front against the room. Judge Wallace stepped up to the wooden podium. Wallace was a retired county judge, a man who spent 40 years presiding over property disputes, civil claims, and secular law. He possessed a booming, resonant voice that required no microphone to reach the back corners of the barn. He was the antithesis of Pastor Davies. He offered no spiritual coverings, no sermons on submission, and no theological ultimatums. He dealt in the reality of human partnership. "Please be seated," Judge Wallace instructed. The rustle of clothing filled the room as the guests settled. The Caldwells sat down in eerie unison, moving like a synchronized mechanism. "We gather today not to enforce a tradition, but to celebrate a profound choice," Judge Wallace began, opening his leather-bound portfolio. "Marriage is a contract of equals. It is a foundation built on mutual respect, forged in the fires of compromise, and sustained by the refusal to let external hurdles break your bond." Every single word he spoke landed like a precise hammer strike against Beatrice's ideology. He was systematically dismantling the doctrines she used to control her family. He was praising equality over authority. He was validating Jason's right to choose his own path. I kept my gaze fixed on the judge, but my peripheral vision caught the subtle, involuntary reactions from the front row. Beatrice could not maintain her frozen composure. The secular validation of her son's independence was corrosive to her. She shifted her weight, the silver fabric of her gown rustling harshly against the wooden pew. She crossed her legs, the sharp heel of her shoe tapping a rapid, agitated rhythm against the floorboards. Her neck tendons stood out, tight and strained. Beside her, Sarah leaned over, covering her mouth with her hand. She whispered something frantic into Thomas's ear. Thomas gave a stiff, jerky nod, his eyes darting toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall. The psychological endurance test was reaching its boiling point. The Caldwells had come to project superiority, expecting the secular ceremony to feel hollow and uninspired. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a front-row seat, forced to listen to a respected judge validate the exact partnership they had spent 6 months trying to destroy. The pressure inside the front 3 rows stretched tight, singing like a piano wire tuned far past its breaking point. A woman drowning in secret financial ruin, watching her control evaporate in real time, cannot sit still. Judge Wallace smiled, turning a page in his portfolio. His warm, booming voice filled the silent, high-ceilinged room. "Jason and Linda," he said, stepping back slightly to give us the floor, "it is time to make your promises. Please turn and face each other for your vows." I shifted my stance, turning my body toward Jason. I let go of his left hand, holding his right between both of my palms. He looked down at me, his eyes dark and fiercely present. The ambient noise of the room faded. The rustling fabric, the tapping heels, the suffocating tension from the right side of the aisle, it all melted into the background. We stood on the precipice of the final commitment, seconds away from triggering the explosive reaction Beatrice was desperately holding back. I stood facing Jason, holding his hands, grounding myself in the rough texture of his calluses. The heavy, volatile energy radiating from the front right pew felt like a physical heat source. We had reached the apex of the ceremony. This was the moment the legal framework of our relationship would shift permanently, severing Beatrice's final claim to his future. Judge Wallace nodded to me, signaling it was my turn to speak. I did not write a speech filled with poetic metaphors about destiny. I am a title examiner. I appreciate clear language, binding terms, and the absolute reality of a shared burden. I kept my voice steady, projecting enough volume to carry to the back of the room without utilizing a microphone. "Jason," I began, locking my gaze on his dark eyes, "I promise to be your equal partner. I promise to share the weight of our decisions, to verify our foundation when the ground shakes, and to build a life grounded in truth, not obligation. I vow to protect our independence, today and for all the days we have left." My words were a quiet, surgical dismantling of the predatory prenup his mother had tried to force upon him. I promised partnership, not submission. I promised truth, not the performative piety of her congregation. Jason's hands tightened around mine. He swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing sharply against the crisp collar of his white shirt. He took a slow, deep breath. He did not look at his notes. He spoke directly from the chest. "Linda," Jason said, his voice carrying the deep, resonant timbre of a man who had finally found his footing after a long slide down a steep embankment. "For years, I drifted. I let the currents dictate my direction because fighting the tide required too much friction. You showed me the value of standing firm. You showed me what it means to build something real." He paused. The silence in the barn was absolute. Even the breathing of the guests seemed to halt. "I choose you over everything," Jason stated, infusing the words with a fierce, uncompromising clarity. "I choose our shared reality. I choose our future, unburdened by the past." Unburdened. The words struck the front row like a physical projectile. It was the ultimate, public rejection of the Caldwell legacy. It was a formal declaration of independence, spoken aloud before 60 witnesses and a secular judge. Jason was legally and emotionally severing the chain his mother had kept wrapped around his neck for 3 decades. Right as Jason drew a breath to begin the traditional phrasing of, "for richer or poorer," the tension snapped. A sharp, violent scrape of wood against hardwood shattered the stillness. It echoed through the high-ceilinged barn like the crack of a rifle shot. Beatrice Caldwell stood up. She did not wait for the vows to conclude. She did not shout an objection or launch into a dramatic theological sermon. Her reaction was far more insidious. She rose from her seat with terrifying, calculated precision. The icy silver fabric of her gown cascaded around her legs, catching the sunlight pouring through the large window. She stood tall, her shoulders thrown back, projecting absolute, rigid authority. She looked at her son. Her face was a mask of cold, unadulterated contempt. She did not see a groom standing at an altar. She saw an asset slipping permanently out of her jurisdiction. She saw her $250,000 lifeline evaporating before her eyes. She held Jason's gaze for 3 agonizing seconds, ensuring he felt the full, crushing weight of her rejection. Then she slowly turned her head. She looked down the row of chairs, locking eyes with Sarah. Beatrice gave a single, sharp nod. It was a silent command, an execution order. The response was instantaneous. It lacked any hesitation or individual thought. Like a programmed hive mind responding to a central signal, the Caldwell family moved. Sarah stood up, her jaw set, refusing to look toward the altar. Thomas rose beside her, adjusting his suit jacket. In the second row, the aunts and uncles pushed themselves out of their chairs. In the third row, the cousins followed suit. The synchronized rustling of heavy wool coats, the shifting of 22 adult bodies filled the cavernous room with a chaotic, aggressive noise. They did not whisper apologies. They did not cast sympathetic glances toward Jason. They obeyed their matriarch. They stepped out from between the rows of white chairs and filed into the center aisle. Beatrice led the formation. She turned her back on the altar, her silver gown sweeping the woven runner, and began a slow, deliberate march toward the rear of the hall. The rest of the family fell into step behind her, forming a long, dark procession. The sheer monumental disrespect took the oxygen entirely out of the room. It was an act of psychological violence designed to maximize public humiliation. Judge Wallace stopped speaking. He lowered his leather-bound portfolio, his mouth slightly open, staring at the retreating figures in genuine shock. In 40 years on the bench, he had never witnessed an organized walkout in the middle of a legal proceeding. On the left side of the aisle, my family gasped. My mother half rose from her seat, her face flushed with sudden protective fury. My father placed a restraining hand on her arm, his expression dark and thunderous. Low murmurs of disbelief rippled through my friends and colleagues. I stood frozen at the altar. I did not turn my head to watch them leave. I kept my eyes locked on Jason. His face drained of color, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. His grip on my hands loosened, his fingers going slack as the shock registered. He stared over my shoulder, watching the backs of his relatives, the people who shared his blood, actively abandoning him during the most vulnerable moment of his life. The sound of their footsteps was a rhythmic, agonizing drumbeat on the hardwood floor. Click, clack, click, clack. It was meant to break him. Beatrice intended for this specific, cruel exit to fracture his resolve so profoundly that the wedding would halt entirely. She wanted him to crumble, to stop the ceremony, to chase after them into the parking lot. She wanted him to realize that survival without her approval was impossible. The procession reached the back of the hall. Beatrice grasped the heavy iron handle of the right oak door. Thomas grabbed the left. They pulled simultaneously. The thick doors swung open, letting in a blinding, brutal slice of bright Montana winter sunlight. The sudden glare illuminated the dust motes dancing in the cold air. Beatrice stepped over the threshold, leading her clan out of the sanctuary and into the vestibule. The heavy oak doors swung back. The brass latches engaged with a loud, final click, echoing off the wooden rafters. Then, the slam of the exterior building doors reverberated through the walls, signaling their complete exit into the freezing parking lot. They were gone, all 22 of them. The right side of the ceremony hall sat completely empty, 3 rows of pristine white chairs, barren and abandoned, facing the altar. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was absolute. It rang in my ears, heavy and oppressive. The string quartet sat frozen, their bows hovering inches above their instruments. The photographer lowered his camera, staring at the empty pews. 60 guests on the left side of the room held their breath, waiting for the fallout. The psychological endurance test had culminated in an explosion. The localized climate of misery was replaced by the raw, bleeding aftermath of total abandonment. We were left standing in the wreckage of a family, staring into a stunned, terrifying silence, the fate of our marriage hanging precariously in the balance. The tension in the room was a physical weight, pressing down on Jason's shoulders, demanding an immediate answer. Would the trauma win, or would the promise hold? The silence left in the wake of the slamming exterior doors did not merely exist. It possessed a physical density. The air in the high-ceilinged barn felt drained, creating a sudden vacuum that pressed against the eardrums of every person remaining in the room. The string quartet sat paralyzed. The photographer lowered his camera, staring at the empty white chairs on the right side of the aisle. The indentations from 22 bodies remained visible on the seat cushions, the only evidence that the Caldwell family had ever been there. On my side of the aisle, the shock quickly morphed into a fierce, protective outrage. Out of my peripheral vision, I saw my mother push herself halfway out of her seat. Her face flushed a deep, mottled red. Her hands curled into tight fists at her sides, her posture practically vibrating with the urge to march out into the snow and wage a physical war in the parking lot. My father remained seated, but placed a firm, restraining hand on her forearm, pulling her gently back down. His jaw set into a grim granite line. Judge Wallace stood at the wooden podium, his hands resting flat against his leather-bound portfolio. He had spent 4 decades presiding over messy divorces, bitter property disputes, and the ugly fractures of human relationships. But the raw cruelty of an organized, silent walkout during a wedding ceremony left him momentarily adrift. He looked at the closed oak doors at the back of the hall, then turned his gaze back to us. His eyes softened, carrying the deep, worn empathy of a man who recognized profound trauma. "Son?" Judge Wallace asked, his booming voice dropping to a low, gentle rumble. "Do you want to take a minute?" It was a generous offer. It was a sanctioned opportunity to pause the proceedings, to step off the altar, and to catch his breath. But I knew the danger hidden inside that pause. If Jason stepped down from the altar, the momentum of our union would stall. If he walked into the vestibule to process the betrayal, the gravitational pull of his childhood conditioning might drag him out the front doors. The conflict raging inside the barn was no longer about Beatrice. The battleground had shrunk to the space between Jason's ears. He stood on a razor-thin precipice. The internal war waged across his features in real time. I watched the color drain from his face. His chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow bursts. He looked past me, fixing his stare on the heavy oak doors at the rear of the sanctuary. Behind those doors lay the people who raised him, his mother, his sister, the aunts who baked him birthday cakes, the uncles who taught him how to cast a fly rod. They had drawn a line in the freezing Montana gravel and demanded he choose between his past and his future. They demanded a chase. They expected him to drop my hands, run out into the cold, and beg for their return. They engineered this exit specifically to break him. I did not squeeze his hands. I did not whisper urgent pleas for him to stay. In my profession, you cannot force a client to sign a contract if they fear the terms. They must accept the liability on their own. I had to let Jason stand on his own 2 feet and evaluate the cost of his survival. If he chased them, the marriage was over before the ink touched the paper. If he stayed, he orphaned himself from his bloodline. For 10 agonizing seconds, the entire room held its collective breath. Jason kept his eyes locked on the closed doors. Then, a subtle but profound shift occurred in his posture. The rapid, shallow breathing slowed, dropping deep into his chest. The tension in his shoulders melted away, replaced by a rigid, unyielding structure. The frayed edges of a grieving son vanished, and the grounded, practical man who navigated treacherous river currents returned. He slowly turned his head away from the exit. He brought his focus back to the altar. He looked directly into my eyes. The wet sheen of unshed tears gathered along his lower lashes, but his gaze carried an impenetrable clarity. The warmth flooded back into his hands. His fingers, previously slack with shock, tightened around mine. The grip felt like forged iron. It was an anchor dropping to the ocean floor, catching on solid rock, holding fast against the storm. He had calculated the cost of his mother's approval, and he had decided the price was far too high. "No," Jason said. The single syllable resonated through the quiet barn. It did not shake. It carried the crisp, definitive ring of a gavel striking a sound block. Jason cleared his throat, adjusting his stance. He squared his shoulders to the judge. "I do not need a minute," Jason informed him, projecting his voice so the sound reached the very back row of my seated guests. I was in the middle of a promise. A collective, shuddering exhale swept through the left side of the aisle. The tension broke, replaced by an electric current of anticipation. Jason turned his full attention back to me. He ignored the vacant chairs. He ignored the empty space where his family should have been. He leaned in a fraction of an inch, closing the physical distance between us, ensuring I felt the full weight of his conviction. "I take you as my wife," Jason stated, picking up the vows exactly where the interruption had severed them. "I take you today, and I take you for every day we are given. I choose a life built on truth. I choose you exactly as you are." The relief that flooded the room was a tangible force. It swept away the lingering toxicity left behind by the Caldwell exodus. When he finished the sentence, my side of the aisle erupted. It was not polite, formal wedding applause. It was a spontaneous, visceral roar of triumph. My college friends jumped to their feet, cheering loudly. My uncles whistled. My mother stood up and clapped until her palms turned red, the tears freely spilling down her cheeks. They cheered for a man who stared down a lifetime of manipulation and chose to walk away from his abusers. They cheered for a foundation that refused to crack under extreme pressure. Judge Wallace smiled, a wide, genuine expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He raised his hands, gesturing for the crowd to settle, though the joyful murmurs continued to buzz beneath his words. He asked for the rings. Jenna stepped forward, placing a plain gold band into my palm. The best man handed Jason a matching circle of metal. We exchanged the rings. The gold felt cold against my skin, a stark contrast to the burning heat of Jason's touch. We recited the final binding phrases without a single tremor in our voices. We sealed the legal contract with the oldest ritual in human history. "By the power vested in me by the state of Montana," Judge Wallace proclaimed, his voice booming with triumphant finality, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may seal this promise." Jason did not hesitate. He pulled me in, his hands framing my face, and kissed me. The kiss held the desperate, breathless energy of two people who had just survived a shipwreck and finally reached the shore. We broke apart, resting our foreheads together for a fleeting second, sharing a private, unspoken acknowledgement. We had won. The emotional umbilical cord tying him to Beatrice was permanently severed. We turned to face the cheering crowd. The string quartet launched into an upbeat, vibrant recessional melody, the bright notes soaring over the applause. Jason tucked my hand into the crook of his arm. We stepped off the altar and began our walk back down the center runner. We walked past my cheering relatives. We walked past the 3 rows of empty white chairs on the right. They no longer held any power. They were just vacant furniture. We reached the back of the hall. We stepped through the towering doorway and into the shadowed vestibule. Clara stood waiting. Her clipboard was tucked under her arm. Her eyes were wide, still processing the unprecedented drama she had just witnessed. She met my gaze. I gave her a single, sharp nod. Clara moved immediately. She grabbed the heavy iron handles of the oak doors. She pulled them shut, cutting off the view of the empty pews and the cheering guests. The heavy wood thudded into the doorframe. Then, Clara reached up to the antique brass hardware. She grasped the thick metal levers. With 2 loud, satisfying clicks, she slid the heavy deadbolts deep into their iron casings. The ceremony hall was sealed. The interior perimeter was officially locked down. Judge Wallace entered the vestibule through a side corridor, carrying our marriage license and a fountain pen. He laid the thick, watermarked paper onto a small wooden credenza. Jason picked up the pen first. He signed his name with dark, sweeping strokes. I took the pen from his fingers, leaned over the document, and pressed the nib to the paper. Beatrice had fired her ultimate weapon. She unleashed a mass family walkout designed to halt this exact moment. We had survived the blast. We were officially, legally binding our lives together behind locked doors. But our story was far from over. Because as the black ink dried on the legal certificate, 40 yards away in the freezing gravel parking lot, a cellular phone began to ring. Beatrice was standing by her leased luxury SUV, reveling in her self-righteous protest, assuming she had secured her victory. She did not know the corporate attorney from Billings was holding a copy of Harrison Caldwell's conditional trust. The hammer was suspended in the air, and it was about to fall with devastating precision. While Jason and I signed our names in black ink behind the heavy, bolted oak doors of the vestibule, a profoundly different scene was unfolding outside. The winter air in Paradise Valley was sharp enough to crack skin. The 22 members of the Caldwell family clustered together in the frozen gravel parking lot, their breath pluming in white clouds against the dark, forested backdrop. They huddled near the fleet of luxury SUVs, stamping their feet to keep warm. They did not look like a group of people who had just committed a profound act of emotional cruelty. They looked victorious. Sarah leaned against the fender of a black Tahoe, rubbing her gloved hands together, a smug, satisfied smile playing across her lips. Thomas stood beside her, checking his wristwatch, projecting the air of a man who had successfully completed an unpleasant but necessary chore. The aunts and uncles murmured among themselves, exchanging self-righteous nods, congratulating one another on their unified stand against secular corruption. Standing at the center of the formation, Beatrice commanded the space. The brilliant winter sun caught the icy silver fabric of her gown, illuminating her like a beacon. She did not reach for her car keys. She stood, facing the rustic timber facade of the lodge, waiting. She assumed the silence emanating from the building meant the ceremony had collapsed. She calculated that Jason, shattered by the public rejection, was currently arguing with me, apologizing to the judge, or pacing the aisles in a panic. She expected him to burst through those double doors at any moment. She anticipated him sprinting across the icy gravel, his pride broken, ready to beg for her return. She was waiting for the surrender. Instead of Jason's frantic footsteps, a sharp electronic vibration broke the quiet of the parking lot. Beatrice reached into the pocket of her tailored wool coat. She pulled out her cell phone. The screen glared brightly in the cold air. The caller ID displayed a name that made her spine stiffen. It was Mr. Sterling, the corporate attorney from Billings, the man currently managing Harrison Caldwell's vast, frozen estate, was calling her on a Saturday afternoon. Beatrice tapped the green icon and brought the phone to her ear. She adjusted her posture, automatically slipping into the imperious, commanding tone she used to manage the elders at the Congregation of the Valley. "Mr. Sterling," she answered, her voice crisp and sharp. "I must say it is highly unusual for you to contact me outside of normal business hours. Have you finally decided to release the operational funds from the trust? I told you earlier this week the delay is causing unnecessary friction for our family." Mr. Sterling did not offer a polite greeting. He did not apologize for the weekend intrusion. He spoke with the flat, sterile precision of a man reading a legal deposition. "Beatrice," Sterling said. His voice carried zero warmth. It was pure, unadulterated ice. "I am not calling regarding preliminary disbursements. I am calling because I am currently seated in the back row of the ceremony hall at the lodge. I am observing the proceedings." Beatrice frowned, a flicker of confusion crossing her face. "You are at the venue?" "I am," Sterling confirmed, "and I see that you and your entire family have just stood up and exited the building prior to the conclusion of the vows. I am calling to inquire if you are stepping out momentarily or if you are vacating the premises entirely. Are you returning to your seats?" Beatrice let out a harsh, derisive scoff. The sound was loud enough to draw the attention of Sarah and Thomas, who stepped closer to listen. "We are absolutely not returning," Beatrice declared, projecting her voice so her relatives could hear her righteous conviction. "We will not be party to that sin. We made our position perfectly clear. We are leaving the property. We refuse to validate a union that operates outside of our spiritual boundaries." The silence on the other end of the line was thick and heavy. When Sterling finally spoke again, his tone shifted. The professional detachment vanished, replaced by a grim, undeniable warning. "I strongly advise you to turn around, walk back through those doors, and sit down until the marriage license is officially signed," Sterling instructed. Beatrice bristled at the command. She hated receiving orders, particularly from secular outsiders. "You have no authority over my movements, Mr. Sterling. My spiritual convictions dictate my presence, not a lawyer. We are getting into our vehicles right now." "Then I advise you to stay on the line," Sterling replied, his voice dropping into a deadly, quiet register. "Because I am opening Harrison's conditional trust file now. I need to read a specific addendum to you before you start your engine." Beatrice froze. Her hand tightened around her phone. The mention of the trust file snagged her attention. She desperately needed that $250,000 to cover her hidden second mortgage. She needed the balloon payment resolved before her creditors initiated foreclosure proceedings on her stucco fortress. "What addendum?" Beatrice demanded, the edge of panic finally bleeding into her haughty tone. "The reading is not until Monday. You stated that explicitly in your letter." "The final reading is on Monday," Sterling clarified. "However, your late father-in-law instructed me to track the exact timeline of events occurring today. He drafted a highly specific behavioral requirement governing the distribution of the primary estate." Beatrice felt the blood drain from her face. "Behavioral requirement?" "Yes," Sterling continued, the rustling of heavy paper audible through the phone speaker. "Harrison's will explicitly dictates the terms regarding the $4 million in ranch equity and liquid assets allocated to you and Sarah." Sarah, hearing her name, stepped closer, her smug smile faltering. Thomas mirrored her concern, his posture suddenly rigid. Sterling cleared his throat and began to read directly from the legal document. The dispersal of the aforementioned shares to Beatrice Caldwell and Sarah Caldwell is contingent upon one strict, unalterable condition, he recited. The beneficiaries must attend, remain physically present for, and witness the legal marriage ceremony of Jason Caldwell to Linda George. Furthermore, they must witness this event in its entirety, from the processional march to the final signing of the marriage license, without causing any vocal or physical disruption. The words hung in the freezing Montana air. Beatrice stopped breathing. Her lungs seized. The icy silver fabric of her gown suddenly felt incredibly heavy, dragging her down into the gravel. Sterling did not stop reading. Should the beneficiaries fail to meet this exact criteria, the document states, their entire allocated shares are to be immediately and permanently forfeited. The funds will bypass the Caldwell bloodline entirely. Forfeited? Beatrice gasped, the word choking in her throat. Sterling let the legal reality settle over the line before delivering the final, fatal blow. You just walked out on $4 million, Beatrice, Sterling informed her, his voice devoid of any pity. You did not witness the marriage. You witnessed a fraction of it. You staged a disruption and vacated the premises before the vows concluded. You have officially violated the attendance clause. It is a trick, Beatrice screamed, her composure shattering completely. The shriek echoed across the parking lot, startling a flock of ravens from the nearby pines. He cannot do that. It is coercive. We were there. We sat in the front row. You sat in the front row, and then you abandoned your seats, Sterling countered with brutal logic. Harrison anticipated this exact scenario. He knew you would try to weaponize your presence. He asked Linda specific questions about the legal definitions of attendance months before he died. He designed this addendum specifically to test your character. You failed the test. We are coming back inside, Beatrice yelled, her panic escalating into pure, unadulterated terror. We are coming back right now. Tell the judge to wait. The ceremony is over, Beatrice, Sterling stated flatly. They are currently signing the license. The contract is sealed. Beatrice did not bother hanging up the phone. She dropped it. The expensive device hit the frozen gravel, the screen cracking upon impact. She did not even look down. The 22 members of the Caldwell family stared at their matriarch, their faces slack with dawning horror. The self-righteous arrogance evaporated, instantly replaced by the crushing realization of their colossal, self-inflicted financial ruin. They did not wait for a command. The group of adults, previously so stoic and dignified, broke into a frantic, chaotic sprint. Women in high heels stumbled over the icy rocks. Men in heavy wool coats slipped and slid, their arms flailing for balance. They stampeded back toward the rustic timber facade of the lodge. It was a desperate, undignified scramble, fueled by the terrifying prospect of losing millions of dollars. Beatrice led the charge, her icy silver gown dragging through the dirty snow and wet gravel, ruining the pristine hem. She reached the top of the wooden stairs, her chest heaving, her breath tearing through her throat in ragged gasps. She lunged for the heavy iron handles of the exterior doors. She pulled them open, rushing into the shadowed vestibule, leading her panicked relatives back toward the sanctuary. She expected to burst back into the ceremony hall, to demand her seat, to claim she had merely stepped out for a breath of air. But as she reached the heavy oak doors separating the vestibule from the main hall, she encountered an immovable obstacle. She grabbed the brass handles and yanked backward with all her strength. The wood groaned, but the doors did not yield. They did not open a single inch. While Beatrice was sprinting across the parking lot, Clara had followed my instructions with absolute precision. She had slid the antique brass deadbolts deep into their iron casings. The ceremony hall was sealed from the inside. Beatrice Caldwell, the woman who spent her life controlling every door in her empire, was locked out in the cold. The physical barrier separating her from the fortune she desperately needed was impenetrable, and the consequences of her arrogance were about to become horrifyingly permanent. Beatrice Caldwell gripped the ornate iron handles of the towering oak doors. Her knuckles turned white from the exertion. She braced her sensible winter boots against the polished wooden floorboards of the vestibule and pulled backward with a violent, full-body heave. The heavy timber shifted perhaps a fraction of a millimeter. A dull, heavy thud echoed through the narrow entryway as the wood impacted against the unyielding metal of the antique brass deadbolts. The doors held firm. The barrier remained absolute. Beatrice let go of the handles, her chest heaving. The pristine, icy silver fabric of her custom gown was now streaked with dirty snow and wet gravel from her frantic sprint across the parking lot. She stared at the seam where the two doors met, her mind struggling to process the structural defiance. "Open the doors!" she shrieked, her voice cracking, shedding the final remnants of her polished, matriarchal facade. Sarah and Thomas crowded in behind her. The rest of the 22 family members jammed into the confined vestibule, a chaotic mass of panicked adults trapped in a bottleneck. The aunts exchanged terrified glances. The uncles pressed forward, their earlier self-righteous stoicism entirely vaporized by the threat of losing their portions of a $4 million estate. "Let me try," Thomas demanded, pushing his way to the front. He wedged his shoulder against the wood and shoved. He grunted, applying his full weight. "It is locked from the inside," Thomas gasped, stepping back and rubbing his collarbone. "Someone threw the deadbolts." Beatrice's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated horror. She realized this was not a stuck latch. It was an intentional barricade. "We are missing the signing," Beatrice screamed, slamming her open palms against the solid oak panels. The frantic slapping noise filled the tight space. "Jason, let us in! We are here! We came back!" She balled her hands into fists and began pounding on the wood. The rhythmic thumping was desperate, an erratic drumbeat of a woman watching her financial survival slip away second by second. She needed to be inside that room. She needed to fulfill the behavioral condition dictated by Harrison's ironclad trust. If she could just get her eyes on the marriage license before the ink dried, she could argue compliance. She could fight Mr. Sterling in probate court. But she was shouting into a void. Inside the cavernous ceremony hall, the atmosphere was a stark, jarring contrast to the desperate panic unfolding in the vestibule. The heavy oak doors were designed decades ago to insulate the main lodge from the harsh Montana winters. The thick timber effectively muffled the frantic pounding from the outside. Whatever faint thumping did penetrate the wood was entirely drowned out by the triumphant, soaring notes of the string quartet. The musicians had launched into a vibrant, upbeat recessional melody, their bows flying across the strings, filling the high-ceilinged room with a wall of joyful sound. My 60 guests remained on their feet, clapping, cheering, and wiping away happy tears. The collective noise of the celebration created an impenetrable acoustic shield. Jason and I stood near the small wooden credenza, completely oblivious to the frantic scratching at the door. Judge Wallace handed Jason the fountain pen. Jason leaned over the thick, watermarked marriage license. His hand was remarkably steady. He signed his name with dark, decisive strokes. The nib of the pen scratched smoothly across the heavy paper. He handed the pen to me. I took a breath, letting the magnitude of the moment settle over me. I pressed the pen to the paper and signed my new legal name. Judge Wallace took the pen, verified our signatures, and added his own sweeping, authoritative scrawl at the bottom of the document. He capped the pen, folded the thick paper, and slid it into his leather-bound portfolio. "It is done," Judge Wallace announced, offering a warm, satisfied smile. "The contract is sealed. You are officially married." Jason let out a long, ragged exhale. The remaining tension visibly drained from his shoulders. He reached for my hand, interlacing his fingers with mine. The emotional siege was over. The Caldwell family had fired their ultimate weapon, the mass walkout, and we had survived the blast radius. We had secured our perimeter and finalized our union in absolute, uninterrupted privacy. I looked at Clara, the venue coordinator, who stood near the locked oak doors. She offered a subtle, knowing nod. She had executed my instructions perfectly. The Chekhov's gun I loaded before the ceremony began had fired with devastating precision, securing the final necessary parameter for Harrison's legal trap. "All right," Clara called out, raising her voice over the lingering applause in the string quartet. "Ladies and gentlemen, please make your way through the rear doors to the adjoining solarium for cocktails and hors d'oeuvres." Clara walked over to the towering oak doors. She reached up to the antique brass hardware. On the other side of the wood, Beatrice was still pounding, her knuckles bruised and aching. She heard the metallic slide of the deadbolts disengaging. Clara grabbed the iron handles and pulled the doors inward. The bright, joyful energy of the ceremony hall spilled out into the dim vestibule, colliding violently with the terrified, disheveled mass of the Caldwell family. Beatrice stumbled forward as the doors opened, nearly losing her footing. Her carefully styled hair hung in limp, messy strands around her face. Her mascara was smeared, tracing dark, jagged lines down her cheeks. Her breathing was ragged, her chest heaving under the ruined silver gown. She looked past Clara, her frantic gaze sweeping the room until it locked onto Jason. Jason stopped mid-stride. He stared at his mother, completely bewildered by her appearance. 5 minutes ago, she had marched out of the room with the rigid, untouchable dignity of a reigning monarch. Now, she looked like a woman who had just survived a physical assault. "Jason!" Beatrice gasped, her voice hoarse and desperate. She pushed past Clara, stepping over the threshold into the main hall. "We are here. We came back. We witnessed it. We are present for the conclusion of the event." She gestured wildly to her family, who huddled in the doorway behind her, their faces pale and drawn. "See," Beatrice insisted, pointing at Sarah and Thomas, "we are all here. We fulfill the condition." Jason frowned, clearly failing to comprehend her frantic rambling. "Condition? What condition are you talking about?" Before Beatrice could launch into a fabricated explanation, a figure stepped out from the very back row of the white chairs on my side of the aisle. The man wore a pristine, tailored charcoal suit. He carried a slim leather briefcase. His silver hair was perfectly combed. He possessed the calm, clinical demeanor of a predator that had just successfully cornered its prey. It was Mr. Sterling. The corporate attorney from Billings had driven 3 hours to attend the ceremony in person. He had sat quietly in the back row, blending in with my extended relatives, fulfilling his duty to observe the specific behavioral conditions mandated by his late client. He had watched the Caldwell family stage their synchronized walkout. He had watched the heavy oak doors close behind them. He walked slowly down the center runner, the click of his polished dress shoes echoing in the suddenly quiet room. He stopped 3 feet away from Beatrice. "No, Beatrice," Mr. Sterling stated. His voice was not loud, but it carried the chilling, inescapable weight of an absolute legal verdict. "You did not." Beatrice stared at the attorney, her mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from the water. "I was on the phone with you when the judge pronounced them husband and wife," Mr. Sterling continued, his tone devoid of any sympathy. "You were standing in the gravel parking lot. You were actively refusing to return. You only attempted to re-enter the building after I informed you of the financial consequences." "That is a lie!" Beatrice shrieked, the panic escalating into hysteria. She pointed an accusing finger at Clara. "She locked us out. We tried to come back in to witness the signing, but the venue staff barred the doors. It was sabotage." Mr. Sterling did not blink. "A locked door does not alter the timeline of your initial exit, Beatrice. The addendum explicitly required you to remain present for the ceremony in its entirety without causing disruption. You stood up during the vows. You initiated a mass exodus. You disrupted the proceedings, and you vacated the premises. The failure of compliance occurred the second you crossed that threshold on your way out." He unlatched his leather briefcase, pulled out a thick file folder, and held it out toward her. "The terms of the trust are triggered," Mr. Sterling declared. "Your allocated shares and the shares of every individual who participated in your walkout are hereby forfeited. I will file the finalized paperwork with the probate court on Monday morning." Beatrice did not reach for the folder. She stared at the thick stack of paper, her entire world fracturing into microscopic pieces. The realization of her colossal miscalculation hit her with the force of a physical blow. Her financial leverage was gone. The $250,000 second mortgage was going to consume her estate. Her carefully constructed empire within the Congregation of the Valley was about to collapse under the weight of her impending bankruptcy. She turned her gaze back to Jason, her eyes wide and pleading, hoping to find a shred of the compliant, obedient son she used to control. Jason looked at his mother. He looked at the ruined silver gown, the smeared makeup, and the sheer, pathetic desperation radiating from her posture. He finally understood the entire scope of the deception. He understood the predatory prenup, the unannounced visits, the silent boycott, and the walkout. It was never about his soul. It was only ever about his grandfather's money. Jason did not yell. He did not gloat. He simply looked at her with a profound, chilling indifference. "You made your choice, Mother," Jason said, his voice flat and unyielding. "The doors are open now. You can leave." He turned his back on her, offered his arm to me, and we walked toward the solarium to join our reception. We left Beatrice standing in the doorway, surrounded by her horrified relatives, staring into the abyss of a ruin she had entirely orchestrated herself. The trap had sprung, the consequences were locked in, but the final, devastating poetic justice of where Harrison's money was actually going was a secret I had yet to reveal. Beatrice did not surrender quietly. A predator backed into a corner rarely retreats without baring its teeth. The Monday following our wedding, she retained a high-priced civil litigator from Helena. She filed an emergency injunction against Harrison Caldwell's estate, claiming the behavioral stipulations in the trust were coercive, unnatural, and designed under undue influence. She sought to invalidate the entire document and claim her $4 million share by default. She spent the last of her available credit on legal fees, betting her entire survival on a sympathetic judge overturning the will. She failed. Mr. Sterling did not break a sweat in the courtroom. He presented the judge with the time-stamped video footage from the venue's security cameras showing the synchronized walkout. He produced sworn affidavits from the venue staff confirming the exit occurred midway through the vows. Then he submitted the ironclad trust document. Harrison had spent decades building his wealth, and he utilized every ounce of his intellect to protect it. The behavioral clauses were drafted with surgical precision. The judge took less than 20 minutes to dismiss Beatrice's injunction with prejudice. The ruling was final. The money was permanently gone. Stripped of the inheritance she so desperately relied upon, the precarious financial structure Beatrice had built began to crumble. The high-interest private lender holding the $250,000 second mortgage issued a notice of default. Foreclosure proceedings commenced on the sprawling stucco fortress she used as her seat of power. Within 2 months, Beatrice had no choice but to file for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. Because my daily profession involves tracking commercial liability and public debt records, I monitored the bankruptcy filings. When a debtor enters Chapter 7, the court appoints a federal trustee to conduct a rigorous forensic audit of all accounts, searching for hidden assets or fraudulent transfers. That federal audit unearthed a secret so profound it shook the foundation of her insulated community. The public filings revealed the true origin of her staggering debt. Beatrice had not taken out the second mortgage to fund a lavish lifestyle. She took out the loan to cover up a felony. For the past 5 years, Beatrice held the position of primary treasurer for the Congregation of the Valley's new Community Center Expansion Fund. The parishioners donated heavily, trusting her with their tithes. The audit proved she had been systematically siphoning money from the church ledger, funneling the cash into her personal checking accounts to maintain her illusion of extreme wealth. She bought designer clothing, hosted catered luncheons, and leased luxury vehicles using stolen offering money. As the annual church audit approached that winter, Beatrice panicked. She needed to replace the missing funds before the church accountants discovered the gaping deficit in the ledger. She secured the predatory second mortgage as a desperate, temporary patch, transferring the cash back into the church accounts just in time to pass the internal review. She banked her entire strategy on Harrison dying shortly thereafter. She planned to use her anticipated share of his estate to pay off the brutal private loan, wiping the slate clean and burying her crime forever. Our marriage threatened to expose her. She knew a seasoned title examiner marrying into the family would eventually spot the irregularities in the trust disbursements. She tried to force the predatory prenup on Jason to keep me away from the paperwork. When that failed, she orchestrated the mass walkout, hoping to break Jason's resolve and halt the wedding. She gambled her freedom on breaking her son, and she lost everything. The fallout within her religious sect was swift and unmerciful. The Congregation of the Valley prided itself on moral superiority. When the federal bankruptcy trustee subpoenaed the church's financial records to trace the embezzled funds, the truth became undeniable. Pastor Davies, the same man who sat in her dining room and condemned my secular independence, turned on her with breathtaking speed. He convened an emergency meeting of the church elders. They did not offer grace. They did not offer forgiveness. They issued a formal, public decree of excommunication. Beatrice was stripped of her title, her membership, and her social standing. The community she ruled for decades banished her. Her brother-in-law, Thomas, had to postpone his retirement indefinitely to pay down his own mounting debts, as the generous financial bailouts he frequently received from Beatrice abruptly ceased. Her daughter, Sarah, who had blindly followed her mother out the heavy oak doors of the wedding venue, was forced to find minimum wage employment to sustain her household. The orchestrated walkout had not been a display of righteous power. It was an act of collective financial suicide. But the most exquisite layer of consequence was authored by Harrison Caldwell himself. A properly drafted trust always contains a default beneficiary clause. It dictates exactly where the capital flows if the primary heirs fail to meet their mandated conditions. When Mr. Sterling executed the forfeiture, the $4 million bypassed the Caldwell bloodline entirely. Harrison did not leave his fortune to a religious institution. He left it to a prominent, secular wildlife and land conservation trust based in Bozeman. He loved the raw, untamed landscape of Montana far more than he ever loved the performative rituals of his daughter-in-law's church. The conservation charity received the substantial influx of capital just weeks after the wedding. They immediately utilized the funds to purchase a pristine, untouched 500-acre parcel of land in the valley. The geographic location of that land purchase was a masterstroke of poetic justice. The 500 acres sat directly adjacent to the property boundary of the Congregation of the Valley. The charity erected sturdy wire fencing and posted large green metal signs every 50 feet designating the area as a protected secular nature reserve. No development would ever be permitted. No church expansions could ever encroach upon the acreage. Beatrice, now renting a small apartment on the outskirts of town, was forced to live with the knowledge that the inheritance she sacrificed her son to obtain was permanently preserving the wilderness right next door to the community that expelled her. She would have to drive past the conservation signs every single day, a permanent, physical monument to her spectacular failure. Jason and I never contacted her again. We did not send a letter gloating over the bankruptcy. We did not demand an apology. Silence is the most impenetrable boundary you can build against a narcissist. We simply walked away, leaving the abusers to drown in the consequences of their own arrogance. Jason sold his stake in the original outfitter shop and used his savings to launch a new independent guide service. He chose a new name, untethered from the Caldwell legacy, focusing solely on the future. The deep, exhausted shadows that used to haunt his eyes vanished, replaced by the calm, steady focus of a man who finally owned his own life. 2 years after the wedding, we purchased a modest plot of land in Paradise Valley. We did not need a sprawling stucco fortress or a private gate. We built a timber-framed cabin near the river, surrounded by cottonwood trees and the sweeping Montana horizon. We spend our Sunday mornings drinking coffee on the back porch, listening to the current rush over the river stones. There are no mandatory prayer meetings. There are no staged interrogations. There is only the quiet, undeniable peace of a partnership built on mutual respect and unbreakable trust. Harrison Caldwell understood the fundamental nature of greed. He recognized that toxic people will always prioritize their own survival over the well-being of the people they claim to love. He set a trap using nothing but the weight of their own arrogance, valuing character over compliance. Sometimes you do not have to fight your enemies. You do not have to match their volume or engage in their destructive games. You just have to stand firm, verify your boundaries, and let them walk themselves right out of your life. We often believe that the legacy we leave our children is measured in acreage, bank accounts, or the pristine image we project to our community. But the true inheritance we pass down is the psychological framework they use to navigate the world. Looking back at the quiet ruins of the Caldwell family, the most profound lesson is not found in legal loopholes or conditional trust funds. It is a cautionary tale about the fundamental nature of parenting, family responsibility, and the terrifying cost of demanding compliance over character. In American culture, the narrative of the self-made individual is deeply ingrained. We celebrate the pioneer spirit, the idea that a person can step out of their origins and forge a new frontier. We tell our children to seek partnerships built on equality and to leave the nest equipped with an internal moral compass. Yet this cultural celebration of independence often collides painfully with the expectations of traditional family structures. A healthy family acts as a launch pad, providing the necessary fuel and coordinates for a child to take flight. A toxic family acts as an anchor, determined to drag the child down into the depths to keep the parents company. When parents weaponize affection, tying their love to strict obedience, they are not raising a child. They are cultivating a hostage. Emotional awareness is the bedrock of a healthy family. It requires parents to recognize that their children are separate entities with their own convictions, desires, and boundaries. Beatrice Caldwell lacked this awareness entirely. She masked her manipulation under the guise of religious protection, using faith not as a guiding light, but as a heavy chain. She taught her children that love was transactional. Sarah learned to survive by folding herself into a compliant, invisible shape, while Jason was forced to amputate his own family tree to save his future. Consider the burden Jason carried. For years, he navigated the treacherous waters of his mother's expectations, trying to maintain peace by minimizing his own footprint. This is the invisible tax levied on children of manipulative parents. They become hyper-aware of shifting moods, learning to read the emotional weather of a room before they even take off their coats. They are robbed of the carefree nature of youth, forced instead to become emotional diplomats in a household that functions more like a combat zone. When a parent demands this level of hypervigilance, they are not teaching responsibility, they are demanding servitude. But the rot inside that stucco fortress ran deeper than emotional manipulation. It rooted itself in a profound lack of honesty and fairness. A parent's responsibility is to provide a stable foundation, not to secretly mortgage their children's future to cover their own hidden sins. Beatrice's embezzlement and her desperate, secretive loans were acts of profound generational theft. She created a fragile house of cards and expected her son to serve as the structural support when the wind blew. Transparency is vital. Children watch what we do long before they understand what we say. They absorb our relationships with debt, our ethical compromises, and our willingness to face the consequences of our actions. When a parent lives a double life, hiding financial ruin behind a silver gown and a perfect lawn, they teach their children that appearance supersedes integrity. They teach them that deceit is an acceptable tool for survival. The antidote to this toxicity was Harrison Caldwell. He embodied a different, far more resilient set of traditional parenting values. Harrison understood that you cannot force a person to be good, just as you cannot force a pine tree to grow straight by tying it to a stake. True family leadership requires observing the choices your descendants make when they believe no one is watching. Harrison did not rescue Beatrice from her own greed, nor did he simply hand Jason a blank check. He established a framework based on fairness, accountability, and observable character. He valued a strong spine over a polite smile. He taught Jason, even from beyond the grave, that standing up for what is right often means standing alone. By linking his legacy to a test of loyalty and disruption, Harrison offered a final, masterclass lesson in parenting. You give your children the tools to survive, but you let them choose which doors they open and which doors they lock. Raising children requires the courage to let them evolve past our own limitations. It demands that we celebrate their independence rather than fearing their departure. If we raise them with honesty, if we treat them with fairness, and if we nurture their emotional awareness, they will return to us not out of obligation, but out of genuine respect. They will invite us into their lives because we are their safe harbor, not their wardens. The Caldwells lost their son because they demanded he earn a seat at a table that was already rotting from the inside. They staged a walkout to teach him a lesson in submission, and in doing so, they taught him how to survive without them. Stories like this resonate deeply because the fault lines in the Caldwell family exist, in varying degrees, within so many of our own homes. We all know someone who uses guilt as a currency. We all know a family that prioritizes the polished surface over the honest, messy reality underneath. If this reflection echoes a chapter in your own life, or if you are currently navigating the complex journey of setting boundaries with the people who raised you, join our community. Subscribe to the Revenge Order channel. We share these narratives not just for the satisfaction of poetic justice, but to untangle the complicated webs of family, loyalty, and self-preservation. Drop a comment below and share your own experiences with setting limits. As you look at your own family tree, consider the roots you are currently watering. Are you planting seeds of honest guidance, or are you pulling the strings of control? The legacy we leave is not etched into a marble headstone or locked inside a trust fund. It is written in the footsteps of the children who walk away from us. The only question that remains is whether they are walking away to build something beautiful of their own, or if they are simply running for their lives, leaving us alone in the cold, staring at a door we can no longer open.